Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. The Queen Mary had long been known as one of the most haunted places in the world, a massive ocean liner that had served both as a luxury cruise ship and a World War II troop carrier. Its history was rich with stories of tragedy and death, and over the years, it had gained a reputation for being a hotspot for paranormal activity. Ghost tours were a regular occurrence, and many had reported strange sightings, eerie sounds, and even physical contact with unseen entities. So naturally, when a group of friends invited me to join them on an overnight ghost hunt aboard the ship, I couldn't resist. We arrived at the Queen Mary late in the afternoon, the setting sun casting long shadows across the ship's massive hull. The sight of the ship was imposing, its rusted exterior and towering smokestacks a stark reminder of its long and storied past. As we made our way up the gangway and onto the deck, I felt a strange sense of anticipation, a mix of excitement and unease. I had never been a big believer in ghosts, but there was something about the Queen Mary that made me question my skepticism. Maybe it was the ship's history, or maybe it was the stories I had heard. But whatever it was, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us. Our guide met us at the entrance to the ship's interior, a cheerful woman who had been leading ghost tour on the Queen Mary for years. She gave us a brief history of the ship, recounting tales of mysterious deaths, strange accidents, and sightings of long-dead passengers and crew members. The Queen Mary, she told us, was a place where the past and the present seemed to overlap, where the spirits of those who had died aboard the ship were said to still linger. Unable or unwilling to move on, as we made our way deeper into the ship, the air grew colder, and the sounds of the outside world faded away, replaced by the low hum of the ship's machinery and the creaking of its old metal frame. The corridors were narrow and dimly lit, and the walls were lined with photographs and artifacts from the ship's heyday. It was easy to imagine what life must have been like aboard the Queen Mary in its prime, the luxury, the glamour, and the sense of adventure that must have filled the air. But there was another side to the ship's history, a darker side that we would soon encounter. We started our ghost hunt in the ship's first-class swimming pool, a beautiful but eerie space that had been closed to the public for decades. The pool itself was empty, its once pristine tiles cracked and worn with age. The air was thick with the smell of mildew, and the only sound was the faint dripping of water from somewhere deep within the ship's bowels. Our guide told us that this was one of the most active areas of the ship, with many reports of ghostly apparitions, unexplained sounds, and strange cold spots. As we stood by the edge of the pool, listening to our guide's stories, I suddenly felt a sharp drop in temperature. It was as if someone had opened a door to the outside, letting in a blast of cold air, but there were no doors or windows nearby. I glanced around, expecting to see one of my friends playing a prank, but everyone was standing still, listening intently to the guy. I shrugged it off, chalking it up to a draft or a trick of the mind, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. We continued our tour of the ship, visiting the engine room, the boiler room, and the infamous Door 13, where a crew member had been crushed to death during the ship's service as a troop carrier. Each area had its own stories of tragedy and paranormal activity, and the further we ventured into the ship, the more uneasy I felt. The Queen Mary was massive, a labyrinth of narrow corridors, steep staircases, and dark, claustrophobic spaces. It was easy to get lost, both physically and mentally, and I found myself constantly glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone lurking in the shadows. But it wasn't until we reached the ship's most haunted area, the first-class staterooms, that things took a turn for the truly terrifying. Our guide led us to a specific room, B340, which had been the site of numerous reports of paranormal activity over the years. Guests who had stayed in the room had reported everything from strange noises and cold spots to the feeling of being watched or even touched by unseen hands. The room had been closed to the public for years due to the frequency and intensity of the reports, but tonight we would be spending the night there. As we entered the room, I immediately felt a sense of unease. The room was small and unremarkable, with a single bed, a dresser, and a small bathroom. But there was something about the space that felt wrong, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. I tried to shake off the feeling, reminding myself that it was just an old, musty room on an old, musty ship. But as the night wore on, the atmosphere in the room grew more oppressive. We set up our equipment, cameras, voice recorders, and EMF detectors, hoping to capture some evidence of the paranormal. At first, everything was quiet. We sat in the dark, listening to the sounds of the ship, the creaking of the metal, the distant hum of the engines. But then, around midnight, things started to happen. It began with a series of soft knocks coming from somewhere inside the walls. At first I thought it was just the ship settling, but the knocks were too rhythmic, too deliberate. They seemed to be coming from all around us, growing louder and more insistent. Then the temperature in the room dropped dramatically, and I could see my breath in the air. I glanced over at my friends, and I could tell they were feeling it too. We all huddled together on the bed, our eyes scanning the darkened room, trying to find the source of the noise. But there was nothing, no visible presence, no movement, just the relentless knocking and the cold, suffocating air. And then, suddenly, the bed began to shake. It started as a slight vibration, barely noticeable at first, but then it grew more violent, the entire bed frame rattling as if something or someone was trying to pull it apart. I clung to the edge of the mattress, my heart racing, my mind struggling to make sense of what was happening. I could feel a presence in the room with us, something dark and malevolent, but I couldn't see it. It was as if the very air around us had come alive, swirling with an invisible energy that pressed down on me, making it hard to breathe. The bed stopped shaking just as suddenly as it had started, leaving us all in stunned silence. But the silence didn't last long. From the corner of the room, near the dresser, came the sound of a low, guttural growl. It was faint at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, filling the room with a sense of dread that I had never experienced before. I couldn't take it anymore. I jumped off the bed and bolted for the door, my heart pounding in my chest. My friends followed close behind, none of us willing to stay in that room a second longer. We raced down the corridor, our footsteps echoing off the metal walls, until we reached the safety of the ship's deck. The cold night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I collapsed onto a bench, gasping for breath. We never went back to that room. In the days that followed, I tried to make sense of what had happened. I watched the footage from our cameras, listened to the recordings from our voice recorders, but there was nothing, no evidence of the knocking, the shaking bed, or the growling voice. It was as if the ship had swallowed up the proof of our experience, leaving us with nothing but our memories. But I knew what I had felt, what I had seen. The Queen Mary was haunted, and whatever was lurking in that stateroom was not something to be taken lightly. I still think about that night sometimes, wondering what would have happened if we had stayed, if we had dared to confront the presence that had made itself known to us. But I don't think I'll ever go back to find out. The sound of glass shattering jolted me awake. It was dead of night, and the darkness in my bedroom was only punctuated by the occasional flash of lightning from the storm raging outside. I had been asleep for only a few hours, my mind still tangled in the fog of dreams. I lay still, trying to make sense of the noise that had pulled me from my slumber. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but this sound had been distinct, sharp, and unmistakable. Heart racing, I reached for my phone on the nightstand, its dim light casting eerie shadows across the room. I checked the time. 3:15 a.m. The break-in was not a new fear for me. I'd heard the stories, seen the headlines, and had always prided myself on being prepared. I had installed a security system, and even taken a few self-defense classes. But as I lay there, fear gripped me tightly, rendering my plans and preparations useless. I slipped out of bed, my bare feet cold against the wooden floor. The house was silent now, save for the distant rumble of thunder. I crept to the door, my breathing shallow and cautious. With every step I could feel the tension in the air, like the calm before a storm. My flashlight was tucked into my drawer, so I grabbed it and turned it on, casting a beam of light that seemed to dance and flicker as I moved. The hallway was dark and quiet, the only sound my own footsteps echoing softly. I made my way downstairs, moving with deliberate care. The front door was locked, as it should be, but the back door was another story. I'd left it to unlock earlier, thinking it would be safer in case of a fire and ironic twist, given the circumstances. As I approached the back door, I noticed the latch was slightly askew, and the door itself was slightly ajar. A cold shiver ran down my spine as I pushed the door open. The kitchen was in disarray, chairs were knocked over, and the table was cluttered with broken glass. The rain poured in through the open door, soaking the floor and adding a chilling touch to the scene. I could hear the drip-drip of water falling from the ceiling, mingling with the sound of my own quickened breathing. I glanced around, my flashlight sweeping across the room. My heart skipped a beat when I noticed something out of place: footprints in the mud leading from the door into the living room. They were large and muddy, and I could see them clearly in the light of my flashlight. My mind raced with possibilities. Who could have done this? Were they still here? I moved cautiously through the living room, every creak of the floorboards amplified in the stillness. My eyes were drawn to a shadow in the corner, where the furniture had been shifted and the curtains were pulled askew. I could feel my pulse pounding in my ears as I approached the shadow. My flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, the shadow resolved into a figure, a tall man, his face obscured by a dark hoodie. He was hunched over, rummaging through the contents of my drawers. The sight of him made my blood run cold. I took a step back, trying to stay hidden behind the doorframe, but he seemed to sense my presence. He turned abruptly, his eyes meeting mine in the dim light. Without thinking, I bolted for the front door, my mind screaming at me to get out. I flung it open and stumbled outside, the rain pounding down and soaking me to the bone. I dashed to my car, but as I reached for the door handle, I heard the sound of footsteps behind me. The intruder was coming after me. Panic surged through me as I fumbled with my keys, desperately trying to unlock the car door. I could hear the intruder's heavy breathing getting closer, each step a reminder of the danger I was in. Finally, the door swung open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut and locking it. Just as the intruder reached the vehicle, I glanced through the window and saw him standing by the car, his face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and menacing. I could see the outline of his features, a gaunt face with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that sent a shiver down my spine. I started the engine and hit the gas, the tires screeching as I sped away from the house. The drive was a blur of rain and darkness. The only sound the roar of the engine and the pounding of the rain on the roof. I didn't stop until I reached the police station, my hands shaking as I recounted the events to the officers on duty. They assured me they would send a patrol to check my house, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered. Even as they took my statement, I stayed at a friend's house that night, unable to return to my own home. The thought of the intruder lurking around, waiting for me to come back, was too much to bear. When I finally returned to the house the next day, the police had cleared it, and everything seemed to be in place. They found no sign of the intruder, no evidence of a forced entry beyond the back door, but the experience had changed me. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, now filled me with a sense of dread. I installed additional security measures and became hyper-vigilant, but the fear of that night never fully left me. I couldn't shake the image of the intruder's face. The way his eyes had looked at me with such malevolence. In the end, I never found out who the intruder was or what he wanted. The police never made any arrests, and the case eventually went cold. But sometimes, when the rain falls heavily and the wind howls outside, I still feel a chill down my spine, as if he's still out there, waiting for me to let my guard down. I've been a nurse for over 20 years, and I've seen just about everything you can imagine. The miracles, the tragedies, the triumphs, and the losses. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened at St. Mary's Hospital during the summer of 2016. Mary's was an old hospital built in the early 1900s, and it had seen its fair share of history. It had been expanded and renovated over the years, but there were parts of the building that hadn't changed much since the day it was built. The basement, where the old boiler room was located, still had the original stone walls, and some of the upper floors had the same narrow hallways and small, cramped rooms that had been used for decades. It was on one of these upper floors that I worked, in the intensive care unit ICU. The ICU was always a busy place, filled with the beeping of monitors, the hum of ventilators, and the constant movement of doctors and nurses. It was a place of high tension, where every decision could mean the difference between life and death. But it was also a place where strange things happened, things that couldn't be explained. The first time I noticed something was off was during a night shift. The ICU was quiet, with most of the patients either asleep or sedated. I was doing my rounds, checking on each patient, making sure their vitals were stable and that they were comfortable. It was a routine I had done hundreds of times before, but that night something felt different. As I was checking on one of the patients, an elderly man who had been admitted after a severe heart attack, I felt a chill run down my spine. It wasn't unusual for the ICU to be cold, but this was different. It was a bone-deep cold that seemed to seep into my very being. I looked around, but everything seemed normal. The monitors were beeping steadily, the lights were dimmed as usual, and there was nothing out of place. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. At first, I thought it was just a shadow, maybe a trick of the light. But as I turned to look, I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway just beyond the reach of the dim lights. It was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned nurse's uniform, the kind they wore back in the 1950s or 60s. She was just standing there, staring at me, her face partially obscured by the shadows. I blinked, and she was gone. I shook my head, trying to clear it. I was tired, that was all. It had been a long shift, and my mind was playing tricks on me. I finished my rounds and returned to the nurse's station, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. But that was just the beginning. Over the next few weeks, more and more strange things started happening. Equipment would malfunction for no apparent reason. Monitors that had been working perfectly would suddenly start beeping, even though the patient's vitals were fine. The lights would flicker, plunging the ICU into darkness for a few seconds before coming back on. And there were cold spots, areas of the unit where the temperature would drop suddenly, even though the rest of the hospital was warm. But the worst part was the sightings. Several of the night staff reported seeing a woman in an old-fashioned nurse's uniform wandering the halls. Sometimes she would be standing at the end of a hallway just like I had seen her that first night. Other times, she would be seen entering a patient's room only to disappear when someone followed her. No one could explain who she was or where she came from. There were no records of any nurse fitting that description working at St. Mary's, and none of the older staff members recognized her. It got to the point where some of the night nurses refused to work alone. They would pair up, staying together as they did their rounds, too scared to be alone in the darkened hallways. And every time someone saw the woman, they reported feeling that same bone-deep cold, the kind that made your teeth chatter and your breath fog in the air. But the strangest thing was that the patients seemed to be aware of her, too. One night I was caring for a woman in her 60s who had been admitted with severe pneumonia. She was in bad shape, struggling to breathe, even with the help of a ventilator. As I was adjusting her for, she suddenly opened her eyes and grabbed my arm with surprising strength. "She was here," she whispered, her voice raspy and weak. "The nurse? She was just here." I looked around, but there was no one else in the room. "There's no one here, Mrs. Thompson," I said, trying to calm her down. "You must have been dreaming." But she shook her head, her eyes wide with fear. "No, I saw her. She was standing right there, by the door," she told me. She told me it was time to go. I felt a chill run down my spine, but I tried to keep my voice steady. "It's okay, Mrs. Thompson. You're safe here. We're going to take good care of you." She didn't seem convinced, but she eventually settled back into her bed, her grip on my arm loosening. I stayed with her for a while, holding her hand until she drifted off to sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. The next morning, Mrs. Thompson passed away. It wasn't unexpected. She had been very sick, and we had been preparing for the worst. But the timing was unsettling, coming so soon after she had seen the mysterious nurse. After that, the sightings became more frequent, and the strange occurrences in the IQ grew more intense. One night, a nurse named Linda was working a double shift, covering for a colleague who had called in sick. She was exhausted, struggling to keep her eyes open as she did her rounds. As she passed by one of the empty rooms, she heard a noise, a soft, rustling sound, like someone moving around inside. She opened the door, expecting to find one of the cleaning staff, but the room was empty. She stepped inside, looking around, and that's when she saw a figure standing by the window. Its back to her. It was the nurse. Linda froze, her heart pounding in her chest. The figure didn't move, didn't turn around. It just stood there, staring out the window, its hands clasped in front of it. Linda could see the outline of the old-fashioned uniform, the white cap perched on the figure's head. "Hello?" Linda's voice trembled as she spoke, but the figure didn't respond. Summoning her courage, Linda took a step closer. "Can I help you?" At that moment, the figure turned slowly, and Linda felt her blood run cold. The face she saw was not human. It was gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into her soul. The skin was pale, almost translucent, and the lips were drawn back in a ghastly, unnatural smile. Linda let out a scream and stumbled backward, her hand fumbling for the light switch. The room was suddenly flooded with light, and when she looked again, the figure was gone. She was alone in the room, her heart racing, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She ran out of the room and didn't stop until she reached the nurse's station. She was shaking, barely able to get the words out as she told the others what had happened. But when they went back to the room, there was no sign of the nurse, no indication that anyone had been there at all. Linda quit her job the next day, and I couldn't blame her. Whatever was haunting the ICU at St. Mary's, it wasn't something you could just ignore or explain away. It was real, and it was getting stronger. The final incident happened just a few weeks later. We had admitted a young man, barely in his 20s, who had been in a car accident. He was in critical condition, barely clinging to life. We were doing everything we could to stabilize him, but his injuries were severe, and the prognosis wasn't good. I was working the night shift again, and the ICU was quiet, save for the hum of the machines keeping our patients alive. I was at the nurse's station, updating some charts, when I heard the alarm go off in the young man's room. His heart rate had spiked, and his blood pressure was dropping rapidly. I rushed into the room, expecting to find him in distress, but what I saw stopped me in my tracks. The nurse was there, standing by his bedside, her hand resting gently on his forehead. She turned to look at me, her hollow eyes locking onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I couldn't move, couldn't speak. I was rooted to the spot, my heart pounding in my chest, and then, as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. The room was empty, and the young man's vitals were stabilizing. It was as if nothing had happened, but I knew better. I had seen her, and I knew that whatever she wasn't done with us. The young man survived, against all odds, and was transferred to another hospital a few days. My life changed one fateful evening in a way I could never have anticipated. It started like any other evening. I was in my apartment, settling in after a long day at work. My routine was mundane: a quick dinner, a few hours of TV, and then off to bed. But that night something felt different, an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I'd recently inherited an antique mirror from my grandmother, a beautiful piece with intricate carvings and a deep, dark frame. It was a family heirloom, something I'd always admired. I decided to place it in my bedroom, thinking it would add a touch of elegance to the space. As I hung the mirror on the wall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind it. That night I woke up to find myself sweating and tangled in my sheets. My room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. I turned my head towards the mirror, and in its reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure, shrouded in shadow, standing behind me. It was indistinct, just a silhouette, but its presence was unmistakable. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the light or a result of my groggy state. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, closer this time. Panic surged through me, and I jumped out of bed, turning to face the mirror directly. The room was empty. The mirror's surface was just a regular reflection of my room. I checked behind the furniture and under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. I tried to shake off the fear, attributing it to a nightmare or my overactive imagination. But as the days went by, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I would catch glimpses of the dark figure in the mirror's reflection, always just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing. When I turned to look directly, I started avoiding the mirror, covering it with a sheet whenever I was home. Despite my attempts to ignore it, the figure seemed to grow more aggressive. It began to manifest more clearly, and the sense of dread it brought was palpable. I could hear whispers in the dead of night, voices that seemed to come from the mirror itself. They were incoherent at first, just murmurs, but gradually they became more distinct, more menacing. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep due to the oppressive atmosphere in the room, I heard the whispers turn into a clear, chilling message. "You can't escape." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I looked at the mirror, and the figure was now fully visible, a grotesque and distorted face, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Desperate to understand what was happening, I researched the mirror's history. I learned that it had belonged to a distant relative who had suffered a tragic fate. Rumors of possession and madness surrounded their story. The mirror had been in the family for generations, each owner experiencing similar unsettling phenomena before falling into despair or madness. I consulted a local historian who specialized in paranormal artifacts. He told me that mirrors, especially antique ones, can sometimes hold on to residual energies or entities, acting as conduits between our world and the supernatural. He suggested that the figure I was seeing might be a trapped spirit or a malevolent presence that had attached itself to the mirror. Determined to rid myself of the haunting, I arranged for a professional exorcism to be performed on the mirror. The ritual was intense and draining, and the entire time I felt as though the presence was fighting back, resisting the attempts to cleanse it. The room was filled with a cold, oppressive energy, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. The exorcism seemed to work temporarily. The mirror's presence became less intrusive, and the figure's appearances and its reflection grew infrequent. However, the damage had already been done. The fear and anxiety had taken a toll on my mental well-being. I no longer felt safe in my own home, and the mirror was a constant reminder of the ordeal I had endured. Eventually, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I had it removed from my home and placed in storage, hoping that its negative influence would be contained. But even now I sometimes catch myself glancing at reflective surfaces, half expecting to see that dark figure watching me. The experience has left a lasting scar on my psyche, a reminder that some things are best left unexplored and untouched. The hiking trail was supposed to be a simple getaway, a chance to clear my head and disconnect from the daily grind. I had been feeling burnt out at work, the endless deadlines and long hours weighing heavily on my mind. So when I stumbled upon a blog post about an old, lesser-known trail deep in the woods, I decided it was exactly what I needed. It was described as a hidden gem, a quiet, peaceful place that few people knew about. That's what drew me in, the promise of solitude. I packed light, just a small backpack with the essentials, water, some snacks, a map of the area, and my phone. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, the sun shining brightly as I left the city behind. The road wound through the countryside, eventually turning into a narrow dirt path that led deep into the forest. I arrived at the trailhead around noon, the air cool and crisp with the scent of pine. There were no other cars in the small gravel parking lot, which didn't surprise me. According to the blog post, this trail was off the beaten path, literally and figuratively. It was exactly what I was looking for, a chance to escape the noise and chaos of everyday life. I shouldered my backpack and set off down the trail, the sounds of the forest enveloping me. Birds chirped overhead, their songs echoing through the trees, while the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot provided a soothing rhythm. The trail was well marked, though overgrown in places, as if it hadn't seen much use in recent years. It was beautiful in a wild and tamed way. The further I walked, the more at peace I felt, the stress of the last few months melting away with each step. After about an hour, I came to a fork in the trail. The main path continued straight ahead, but a smaller, less defined trail branched off to the right, disappearing into the dense underbrush. I hesitated, checking my map. The smaller trail wasn't marked, but curiosity got the better of me. I decided to explore it, figuring it would lead me to an even more secluded part of the forest. The trail was narrow and winding, the trees closing in around me as I pushed through the undergrowth. It was darker here, the canopy above thick with leaves that blocked out the sun. I walked for what felt like an hour, the trail becoming more difficult to follow as it twisted and turned through the dense forest. Just as I was about to turn back, I saw it, a cabin nestled among the trees, its wooden walls weathered and gray with age. The roof sagged slightly, and the windows were dark and empty, but the structure appeared mostly intact. It was the last thing I expected to find out here, in the middle of nowhere. I approached the cabin cautiously, my curiosity mixed with a sense of unease. The air felt different here, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. The door was ajar, hanging crookily on its hinges, and as I stepped closer, I could see that the interior was shrouded in darkness. I hesitated at the threshold, a strange feeling washing over me. It wasn't fear, exactly, but a deep, instinctual warning that something wasn't right. But I was already there, and the cabin intrigued me. I pushed the door open further, the rusty hinges creaking in protest, and stepped inside. The air inside the cabin was stale, thick with the scent of damp wood and something else I couldn't quite place. The only light came from the open door behind me, casting long shadows across the floor. The cabin was small, just a single room with a few pieces of old, broken furniture scattered about. An old table stood in the center of the room, its surface covered in a thick layer of dust. A single chair lay on its side nearby, one of its legs broken. On the far wall, a fireplace stood cold and empty, the hearth littered with ashes. Despite the obvious signs of neglect, the cabin didn't feel abandoned, it felt lived in. I couldn't shake the feeling that someone or something was still here. I walked further into the room, my footsteps echoing off the wooden floor. As I reached the table, I noticed something odd. Among the dust and debris on the table was a single, untouched plate, as if someone had set it down recently. I frowned, a chill running down my spine. The plate was clean, the porcelain gleaming in the dim light. But that didn't make sense. No one had been here for years, if not decades. I reached out to touch the plate, but as my fingers brushed the cool surface, I heard a sound behind me, a soft, almost imperceptible creak, like someone shifting their weight on an old floorboard. I froze, my heart racing. Slowly, I turned around, my eyes scanning the dark room. There was nothing there, just the open door and the forest beyond. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming, a suffocating presence that made it hard to breathe. I backed away from the table, my hands trembling, and made for the door. As I reached the threshold, I heard the creak again, louder this time, followed by a soft, raspy whisper. It was a voice, low and hoarse, but I couldn't make out the words. I didn't wait to find out what it was saying. I bolted out of the cabin, the door slamming shut behind me with a force that shook the old walls. I ran down the trail, not caring that it was narrow and overgrown, not caring that I had no idea where it led. All I wanted was to get away from that cabin, away from whatever was inside. The forest seemed darker now, the trees closing in around me as I ran. The air was thick and oppressive, The sounds of the forest muted as if the entire world was holding its breath. I didn't stop running until I burst out onto the main trail, my lungs burning and my legs shaking from the effort. I doubled over, gasping for breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The main trail was as I had left it, bright and open, the sun filtering through the trees. But I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that clung to me, the sense that something had followed me out of the woods. I didn't stop to rest. I didn't even take a moment to catch my breath. I just kept walking, faster now, desperate to get back to the trailhead, to my car, to safety. The forest around me was quiet, as if the birds and animals had all fled. I reached the parking lot in record time, my body running on pure adrenaline. I fumbled with my keys, my hands still shaking, and practically threw myself into the car. The engine roared to life, and I peeled out of the lot, the tires kicking up gravel as I sped away. As I drove, the feeling of being watched gradually faded, replaced by exhaustion and a deep, lingering unease. I didn't look back, not even when I was miles away from the trailhead, back on the main road. I just kept driving, eager to put as much distance between myself and that cabin as possible. It wasn't until I got home, hours later, that I realized something was wrong. I was unpacking my backpack, pulling out my water bottle and snacks, when I found it, the plate. The same plate I had seen in the cabin, clean and untouched. I stared at it, my mind racing, trying to make sense of how it had ended up in my bag. But there was no explanation, no rational reason for it to be there. I left it on the counter, too shaken to deal with it. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cabin, the dark, empty windows, and the untouched plate on the table. And every time I thought about it, I heard that voice, that soft, raspy whisper that I couldn't understand. I don't go hiking anymore. I can't. The woods no longer feel like a place of peace and solitude. Instead, they remind me of that day, of the abandoned cabin, and the thing that still haunts my nightmares. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened, but I can't. Sometimes, when I'm alone in my house, I hear it again, that whisper, faint and distant, like it's calling to me. I thought about getting rid of the plate, about smashing it into a million pieces, but every time I try, I stop myself, because deep down, I know that whatever is attached to it isn't done with me yet, and I'm terrified of what will happen if I let it go. It was a crisp autumn evening in 2018, the kind where the days were getting shorter, and the chill in the air signaled the approaching winter. I had just returned home from work, eager to relax after a long day at the office. My house, a small 2-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood, had always been my sanctuary, the kind of place where you could leave your doors unlocked and not worrying about anything. But that was before everything changed. I remember the night so clearly because it started out so ordinary. I made myself a simple dinner, spaghetti and meatballs, then settled on the couch with my favorite book. The living room was dimly lit, the only sound the soft crackling of the fire in the hearth. I'd always loved the peace and quiet of my home, the way the stillness wrapped around me like a warm blanket. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head upstairs to bed. I checked the locks on the front and back doors, something I'd started doing out of habit ever since a neighbor mentioned a few break-ins in the area. Satisfied that everything was secure, I turned off the lights and made my way upstairs. My bedroom was at the end of the hall, the farthest from the stairs. As I got ready for bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. It was one of those feelings that gnaw at the back of your mind, a sense of unease that you can't quite place. But I dismissed it. chalking it up to the stories I'd heard from my neighbor. I changed into my pajamas, brushed my teeth, and climbed into bed. The sheets were cool against my skin, and the familiar weight of the blankets was comforting. I reached over to turn off the bedside lamp, plunging the room into darkness, and settled in for the night. I must have dozed off quickly because the next thing I remember was waking up in the middle of the night. It was one of those sudden awakenings where you're instantly alert but not sure why. The house was silent, the only sound my own breathing. I glanced at the clock to 37 a.m., and then I heard it. It was faint, so faint that at first I thought I was imagining it, a soft creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. My heart skipped a beat, and I strained to listen, holding my breath. Another creak, this time closer, coming from the direction of the stairs. My mind raced, trying to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was just the house settling, I told myself. Old houses make noises at night, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. The sound was too deliberate, too much like footsteps. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. My phone was on the nightstand, and I grabbed it, unlocking the screen with shaking hands. I didn't call anyone. Not yet. I wanted to be sure. I wanted to believe that there was some logical explanation for the noise. Moving as silently as possible, I crept to the bedroom door and pressed my ear against it. The hallway outside was pitch dark, and the house was still again. I waited, counting the seconds in my head, trying to convince myself that it was nothing. But then I heard it again, a soft, barely audible creak coming from just outside my door. My blood ran cold. Someone was in my house. I didn't know how they had gotten in or what they wanted, but the reality of the situation hit me like a punch to the gut. I was alone, in the middle of the night, with a stranger just on the other side of the door. I backed away from the door, my mind racing with options I could hide. But where? Under the bed, in the closet. Neither seemed safe enough. I could try to escape through the window, but that would mean crossing the room, and I didn't want to make any noise that might alert whoever was out there. And then I remembered the small baseball bat I kept in the closet, a souvenir from my college days. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. I slowly opened the closet door, wincing at the tiny creak it made, and grabbed the bat. The weight of it in my hands gave me a small measure of comfort, but I was still terrified. My phone was still in my other hand, and I debated calling the police. But what if they heard me? What if they broke down the door before the police could get here? I had no idea how many of them there were, or if they were armed. As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I heard the doorknob rattle. It was a slow, deliberate movement, as if someone was testing the door, trying to see if it was locked. I held my breath, gripping the bat so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The door didn't open, but the rattling continued, a maddening, nerve-wracking sound that seemed to go on forever. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, every muscle in my body tense, waiting for something to happen. I don't know how long I stood like that, but it felt like hours. My mind was a whirlwind of fear and confusion, trying to make sense of what was happening. Finally, I heard footsteps again, moving away from the door. They were slow, measured, as if the intruder was in no hurry. The sound grew fainter as they moved down the hall, and eventually I heard the creak of the stairs. I didn't dare move. I just stood there, listening, waiting for some sign that they were gone. I heard the faint click of a door downstairs, followed by the sound of a window being opened. My heart was pounding in my ears, and I felt like I might pass out from the adrenaline. And then, silence. I waited for what felt like an eternity, my body frozen with fear. Finally, I gathered the courage to move I crept to the bedroom door and slowly turned the knob, easing the door open just a crack. The hallway was dark and empty. I couldn't see or hear anything out of the ordinary. I didn't know what to do. Should I check the house, make sure they were really gone, or should I stay in my room and wait until morning? After a few minutes, I made a decision. I wasn't going to wait around to see if they came back. I grabbed my phone and the bat and slowly made my way to the top of the stairs. I peered down into the darkness, trying to see if there was anyone there. The house was silent, the only light coming from the street lamp outside filtering through the curtains. I took a deep breath and started down the stairs, each step slow and careful. My heart was pounding so hard that I thought it might burst out of my chest. When I reached the bottom, I paused, listening for any sound, any sign that I wasn't alone. Nothing. I moved through the living room, keeping the bat in front of me like a shield. The front door was still locked, the deadbolt in place. I checked the windows, making sure they were closed and latched. Everything seemed normal, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Finally, I made my way to the back door, the one that led out to the patio. As I approached, I saw that the door was slightly ajar. My breath caught in my throat. I hadn't left it open, I was sure of that. I reached out with the bat, nudging the door open the rest of the way. The night air rushed in, cold and biting, and I saw that the window above the kitchen sink was wide open. My heart sank. That must have been how they got in and how they got out. I quickly closed and locked the door, then went to the window and shut it as well. My hands were shaking, my mind racing with 100 different thoughts. Who had been in my house? Why had they come? And most importantly, were they gone for good? I didn't sleep at all that night. I stayed on the couch, the bat by my side, my eyes glued to the windows and doors. Every little noise made me jump. Every shadow seemed to hide a threat. I was trapped in my own home, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. When morning finally came, I called the police. They arrived within minutes, but there wasn't much they could do. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints, nothing to indicate who had been in my house. They took a report and assured me they would keep an eye on the neighborhood, but I could tell they didn't think much of it. Just another case of a frightened homeowner, they probably thought, but I knew what I had heard, what I had seen. Someone had been in my house that night, someone who didn't belong. And even though they were gone, the fear they left behind remained. I didn't feel safe in my home anymore. Every creak, every gust of wind made me jump. I started locking all the doors and windows, even during the day. I installed a security system, got new locks, and even bought a bigger, sturdier bat. But none of it helped. The fear was still there, gnawing at me, a constant reminder that my sanctuary had been violated. A few weeks after the incident, I moved out. I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I found a new place in a different part of town, a small apartment with no windows on the ground floor and a security guard at the entrance. It wasn't much, but it felt safer. But even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of that night. The sound of footsteps in the dark, the rattle of the doorknob, the open window, all of it haunts me. I still wake up in the middle of the night sometimes, my heart racing, convinced that someone is in my house. I've learned to live with the fear, but it's always there, lurking in the back of my mind, because once you've experienced something like that, once you've had your safety ripped away from you, you're never the same. And every time I hear a creak in the night, I can't help but wonder if it's just the house settling or if someone is there, just behind the door, waiting. My life changed one fateful evening in a way I could never have anticipated. It started like any other evening. I was in my apartment, settling in after a long day at work. My routine was mundane. A quick dinner, a few hours of TV, and then off to bed. But that night something felt different, an inexplicable heaviness in the air, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. I'd recently inherited an antique mirror from my grandmother, a beautiful piece with intricate carvings and a deep, dark frame. It was a family heirloom, something I'd always admired. I decided to place it in my bedroom, thinking it would add a touch of elegance to the space. As I hung the mirror on the wall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from behind it. That night I woke up to find myself sweating and tangled in my sheets. My room was dark, the only light coming from the moon filtering through the curtains. I turned my head towards the mirror, and in its reflection, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A dark figure, shrouded in shadow, standing behind me. It was indistinct, just a silhouette, but its presence was unmistakable. I blinked and rubbed my eyes, thinking it was a trick of the light or a result of my groggy state. But when I looked again, the figure was still there, closer this time. Panic surged through me, and I jumped out of bed, turning to face the mirror directly. The room was empty. The mirror's surface was just a regular reflection of my room. I checked behind the furniture and under the bed, but there was no sign of anyone. I tried to shake off the fear, attributing it to a nightmare or my overactive imagination. But as the days went by, the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. I would catch glimpses of the dark figure in the mirror's reflection, always just at the edge of my vision, always disappearing when I turned to look directly. I started avoiding the mirror, covering it with a sheet whenever I was home. Despite my attempts to ignore it, the figure seemed to grow more aggressive. It began to manifest more clearly, and the sense of dread it brought was palpable. I could hear whispers in the dead of night, voices that seemed to come from the mirror itself. They were incoherent at first, just murmurs, but gradually they became more distinct, more menacing. One night, as I lay in bed, unable to sleep due to the oppressive atmosphere in the room, I heard the whispers turn into a clear, chilling message. "You can't escape." I bolted upright, my heart pounding. I looked at the mirror, and the figure was now fully visible, a grotesque and distorted face, with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a sinister grin. Desperate to understand what was happening, I researched the mirror's history. I learned that it had belonged to a distant relative who had suffered a tragic fate. Rumors of possession and madness surrounded their story. The mirror had been in the family for generations, each owner experiencing similar unsettling phenomena before falling into despair or madness. I consulted a local historian who specialized in paranormal artifacts. He told me that mirrors, especially antique ones, and sometimes hold on to residual energies or entities, acting as conduits between our world and the supernatural. He suggested that the figure I was seeing might be a trapped spirit or a malevolent presence that had attached itself to the mirror. Determined to rid myself of the haunting, I arranged for a professional exorcism to be performed on the mirror. The ritual was intense and draining, and the entire time I felt as though the presence was fighting back, resisting the attempts to cleanse it. The room was filled with a cold, oppressive energy, and the whispers grew louder and more insistent. The exorcism seemed to work temporarily. The mirror's presence became less intrusive, and the figure's appearances in its reflection grew infrequent. However, the damage had already been done. The fear and anxiety had taken a toll on my mental well-being. I no longer felt safe in my own home, and the mirror was a constant reminder of the ordeal I had endured. Eventually, I decided to get rid of the mirror. I had it removed from my home and placed in storage, hoping that its negative influence would be contained. But even now I sometimes catch myself glancing at reflective surfaces, half expecting to see that dark figure watching me. The experience has left a lasting scar on my psyche, a reminder that some things are best left unexplored and untouched. Working the night shift as a security guard had always been a peaceful job for me. Sure, it could get boring, and the hours dragged on, but I enjoyed the quiet. My job was at a massive, old factory on the outskirts of town. The place was enormous, with long, dark corridors and rooms filled with ancient, rusting machinery that hadn't been touched in years. I was the only one on duty, and it was my responsibility to patrol the grounds, make sure everything was secure, and keep an eye on the surveillance cameras. One night, I was sitting in the small security office, sipping on my third cup of coffee, when something strange caught my attention. The surveillance monitors flickered, showing static for a few seconds before returning to normal. It was unusual, but I chalked it up to faulty wiring or interference. After all, the equipment was as old as the building itself. But as I continued watching the screens, I noticed something odd in the footage from one of the cameras positioned in a long, dimly lit hallway on the second floor. At the far end of the hall, there was movement. A shadow darted across the screen. I leaned in closer, trying to make out what it was. It was too quick to be sure, but it looked like a person, which was impossible because I was the only one there. I grabbed my flashlight and decided to investigate. The halls were eerily quiet as I made my way up the creaky metal staircase to the second floor. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of old, decaying machinery filled my nostrils. The long hallway stretched out before me, the only light coming from my flashlight's beam. I walked slowly, scanning the area for any signs of an intruder. Halfway down the hall, I heard a faint noise, a whisper. It was so soft that I thought I might have imagined it, but then it came again, clearer this time. It was a woman's voice, but I couldn't make out what she was saying. My heart began to race as I shone the flashlight into the darkness, trying to find the source of the sound. There was nothing there. Suddenly, the lights in the hallway flickered and went out completely, plunging me into darkness. I cursed under my breath and fumbled for my radio, but before I could call for help, I heard the whispering again, louder and more frantic. It was coming from behind me. I spun around, shining the flashlight down the hallway, but all I saw was an empty corridor. My pulse quickened as the whispering grew louder, now echoing all around me. It was as if the walls themselves were speaking, the voice becoming more insistent, almost pleading. I started backing away, my instincts telling me to get out of there, but then I heard a loud crash from one of the rooms off the hallway. It sounded like something heavy had been knocked over. Gathering what little courage I had left, I approached the room and pushed the door open. The room was filled with old machinery, and at the far end a large metal cabinet had been toppled over, its contents spilled across the floor. But that wasn't what caught my attention. Standing in the corner, illuminated by my flashlight, was the figure of a woman. Her back was turned to me, her long, dark hair hanging down her back, and she was dressed in a tattered, old-fashioned gown. I froze, my mind racing. How had she gotten in here? I tried to speak, to ask her who she was, but the words caught in my throat. The whispering had stopped, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed in on me from all sides. The woman didn't move, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. I took a hesitant step forward, and as I did, she slowly turned to face me. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids that seemed to suck in the light from my flashlight. Her mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, and as I stared in horror, she raised a hand and pointed directly at me. Fear surged through me, and I turned and ran. I didn't care where I was going, I just needed to get out of that building. My footsteps echoed through the halls as I bolted down the stairs and out into the cold night air. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the keys, finally managing to unlock the door and scramble inside. I drove away from the factory as fast as I could, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally got home, I called my supervisor and quit on the spot. I never went back to that factory again, and I never found out who or what that woman was. But even now, years later, I can still hear her whispering in my dreams, calling out to me from the darkness of that old, forgotten place. I've always loved the outdoors. As a kid, I spent my weekends exploring the dense forests that surrounded our small town in the Pacific Northwest. My dad taught me how to track animals, identify plants, and navigate using nothing but the sun and stars. The woods were my second home, a place where I felt free and at peace, but that changed one summer when I was in my early 20s. What I experienced out there in the deep woods still haunts me to this day. It was the summer of 2010, and I had just graduated from college. I decided to spend a few weeks camping alone in the wilderness before starting my first job. I wanted to reconnect with nature, to enjoy the solitude and beauty of the forest before being tied down by the responsibilities of adulthood. I chose a remote area in the Olympic National Forest, a place I had visited many times with my dad as a kid. The forest was vast and untamed, full of towering trees, crystal clear streams, and miles of unmarked trails. It was perfect. I packed up my gear tent, sleeping bag, food, and a few basic supplies and set out early one morning. The drive to the trailhead took a few hours, and by the time I arrived, the sun was high in the sky. I parked my car, shouldered my pack, and started hiking into the woods. The first day was perfect. The weather was warm, the sky clear, and the forest alive with the sounds of birds and rustling leaves. I found a good spot to set up camp near a small stream and spent the afternoon fishing and exploring the area. As the sun began to set, I built a small fire, cooked dinner, and settled in for the night. The first few nights were uneventful. I spent my days hiking and exploring, and my nights by the fire, enjoying the peace and quiet of the forest. But on the fourth night, something strange happened. I was lying in my tent, trying to fall asleep, when I heard a noise outside. It was a low, guttural growl, unlike anything I had ever heard before. My first thought was that it was a bear. I had encountered bears in the woods before, and while they were intimidating, I knew how to handle them. But this sound was different, more menacing, more deliberate. I sat up, my heart pounding in my chest, and listened. The growl came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, shining the light into the darkness. The forest was still, the only sound the rushing of the nearby stream. But I knew something was out there. I called out, hoping to scare off whatever it was. "Hey, get out of here." My voice sounded small and weak in the vastness of the forest. There was no response, just silence. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept the flashlight close, and my ears tuned to every sound. But the growling didn't return, and by morning, I convinced myself that it was just a bear passing through. Maybe annoyed by the smell of my campfire, I continued my trip, but the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched, that something was following me. I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. On the 5th day, I decided to hike deeper into the forest to a spot my dad and I had discovered years before. It was a secluded valley surrounded by steep hills and dense trees with a small waterfall at the far end. It was one of the most beautiful places I'd ever seen, and I wanted to see it again before heading back. The hike was tough, the trail overgrown and difficult to follow, but I eventually made it to the valley just before noon. The sight of the waterfall brought back a flood of memories, and I spent the afternoon exploring, taking photos, and reminiscing about the trips I'd taken with my dad. As the sun began to set, I made my way back to camp. The trail was even harder to follow in the fading light, and by the time I reached my campsite, it was nearly dark. I quickly set up my tent, built a fire, and cooked a simple dinner, but the feeling of being watched had grown stronger. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there just beyond the light of the fire, watching me. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But as I sat by the fire, the growl came again. This time it was closer, more menacing, and it sent a chill down my spine. I stood up, shining my flashlight into the darkness, trying to see what was making the noise. My hand trembled as I called out again, but there was no response, just the oppressive silence of the forest. I backed toward my tent, keeping the flashlight trained on the trees. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan. I knew I couldn't stay there, not with whatever was out there. I considered packing up and hiking back to my car, but the thought of navigating the dark forest with something lurking in the shadows was too terrifying. So I did the only thing I could. I got into my tent, zipped it up tight, and prayed that whatever it was would go away. The night was long and terrifying. Every sound, every rustle of leaves sent my heart racing. The growls came and went, sometimes closer, sometimes farther away, but always there, a reminder that I wasn't alone in the woods. At some point during the night, exhaustion finally took over, and I fell into a fitful sleep. I dreamed of dark shapes moving through the trees, of glowing eyes watching me from the shadows. I woke up just before dawn, the forest still cloaked in darkness. The growls had stopped, but the feeling of dread remained. I knew I had to get out of there. I quickly packed up my gear, not bothering to eat breakfast or even put out the fire. I just wanted to leave, to get away from whatever was out there. The hike back to the trailhead was a blur. I moved as fast as I could, not caring about the rough terrain or the weight of my pack. I felt like I was being chased, like something was right behind me, just out of sight. When I finally reached my car, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away from the forest, the trees and mountains far behind me. It wasn't until I was safe at home that I allowed myself to think about what had happened. I had always been a skeptic, someone who didn't believe in monsters or ghosts. But what I experienced in those woods was real, something I couldn't explain or rationalize away. Over the years, I've tried to make sense of it. I've read about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest, about other people who've had similar experiences. But no matter how much I read or research, I still can't shake the fear that gripped me in those woods. I haven't been back to the Olympic National Forest since that trip. I haven't been camping at all. The thought of being out there, alone in the wilderness, fills me with a deep, primal fear that I can't overcome. I still love nature, still find peace in the beauty of the outdoors, but now I enjoy it from a distance. I go for hikes in well-traveled areas, stick to places where there are other people, and never, ever go into the deep woods alone, because I know that out there, somewhere in the vast wilderness, there are things you can't explain, things that defy logic and reason, and I never want to come face to face with one of them again. It was supposed to be just another night, a routine patrol through the dense forests that surrounded our small rural town. As the town's only night watchman, I had grown accustomed to the quiet, the stillness that blanketed the woods after dark. The job was simple: drive around, check for any signs of trespassers or illegal hunters, and make sure everything was as it should be. Nothing exciting ever happened, and I liked it that way. On this particular night, the air was thick with fog, the kind that clings to your skin and makes everything feel just a little bit colder. I was making my rounds, the headlights of my truck cutting through the mist as I drove along the narrow dirt roads that wound through the trees. The radio played softly, a faint background noise to keep me company. I was about halfway through my patrol when I first saw it movement in the trees just ahead. At first I thought it might be a deer or maybe a stray dog, but as I got closer, I realized it was something much larger, something that moved in a way that sent a chill down my spine. It was too big to be a dog, and the way it moved, almost as if it were stalking something, was unsettling. I slowed the truck to a crawl, squinting through the fog to get a better look. The creature was standing just at the edge of the tree line, partially obscured by the shadows. It stood on two legs, towering over the underbrush, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, reflecting the beams of my headlights. For a moment I thought it might be a bear, but it was too thin, too upright, and its limbs were too long. I stopped the truck, my hand hovering over the flashlight on the seat beside me. The creature stared at me for what felt like an eternity, its eyes locked onto mine, as if it were sizing me up. My heart pounded in my chest, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. There was something wrong, something deeply unsettling about this creature. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a man. It was something else, something I had never seen before. Before I could react, the creature let out a low, guttural growl that reverberated through the night air. The sound was unlike anything I had ever heard, deep and menacing, like the rumble of thunder before a storm. My instinct screamed at me to get out of there, to drive away as fast as I could, but I was frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from the thing in the woods. Then, in a blur of motion, the creature turned and bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness as quickly as it had appeared. I sat there, stunned, my heart racing as I tried to process what I had just seen. The radio crackled, snapping me out of my daze, and I realized that I needed to report this. Whatever it was, I grabbed the flashlight and stepped out of the truck, my legs shaky as I made my way to the spot where the creature had been standing. The ground was disturbed, the leaves and dirt scuffed and scattered as if something heavy had been standing there. I shined the flashlight into the woods, the beam cutting through the fog, but there was nothing, no sign of the creature, no tracks, nothing. I stood there for a moment, listening to the silence of the forest. The usual sounds of the night, the chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves were gone, replaced by an eerie stillness. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. I backed away slowly, my eyes scanning the trees for any sign of movement. I didn't know what that thing was, but I knew I didn't want to be there if it decided to come back. I hurried back to the truck, slamming the door shut and locking it behind me. My hands trembled as I fumbled for the radio, finally managing to call in a report to the station. They didn't believe me, of course. How could they? I barely believed it myself. They chalked it up to nerves, the fog playing tricks on my eyes, maybe even a stray animal that got too close for comfort. But I knew what I saw. That thing wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a man. It was something else, something that shouldn't exist. I finished my patrol that night, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that those glowing eyes were out there, somewhere in the darkness, following me. I kept the truck's windows rolled up and the doors locked, my hand never straying far from the flashlight. Every shadow, every rustle in the trees sent a jolt of fear through me, and I was never more relieved to see the first light of dawn. The next morning, I went back to the spot where I had seen the creature. The fog had lifted, and the forest looked normal, almost peaceful in the daylight. But as I walked through the trees, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that those eyes were still out there, working just beyond the edge of the light. I never saw the creature again, but I've heard stories, whispers in the town, whole legends passed down through generations. They call it the dogman, a creature that walks the line between man and beast, stalking the woods at night, hunting for those who stray too far from the safety of the town. Some say it's just a myth, a story to scare children into behaving, but I know better. I've seen it, and I'll never forget those glowing eyes, that feeling of dread that washed over me as it stared me down. I've heard the growl, felt the ground tremble beneath its weight. It's real, and it's out there, somewhere in the darkness, waiting. And if you're ever out in the woods at night, alone, you'd better pray you don't cross its path, because if you do, you might not live to tell the tale. I've been driving a taxi for over 15 years, and in that time I've seen all sorts of people. The drunk, the lonely, the lost, all looking for a ride to somewhere, or sometimes just looking for someone to talk to. I've heard confessions, witnessed arguments, and even helped deliver a baby once. But nothing prepared me for what happened one rainy night in November. It was a typical Friday evening, just past midnight. The city was still alive, but the energy was different, quieter, more subdued. The rain was coming down in sheets, the kind that makes the streets glisten like black mirrors. Business was slow, and I was considering calling it a night when the dispatch came through. A pickup in a part of town I didn't usually go to. The address was in an older neighborhood, one that had seen better days. The kind of place where the streetlights flicker and the houses loom like dark shadows. But a fair's a fair, so I set off, windshield wipers struggling to keep up with the downpour. As I turned onto the street, I noticed something strange. The area was completely deserted, no cars, no people, not even a stray cat. Just rows of old houses, their windows dark, as if they were all empty. My headlights barely cut through the gloom, casting long, eerie shadows on the wet pavement. I pulled up to the address and waited. The house was one of those old Victorian types, the kind you see in horror movies. Its paint was peeling, the windows were cracked, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. But what struck me most was the feeling that something was watching me from the house, something unseen, but very real. I checked the time, 12:15 a.m. I was early, so I waited, engine idling, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. 5 minutes passed, then 10. I was about to call it quits when I saw her. She came out of the darkness like a ghost, stepping through the rain without making a sound. She was tall, with long, dark hair that hung limply around her pale face. Her clothes were old-fashioned, a long, flowing dress that looked like something out of another century. But what caught my attention were her eyes, dark, almost black, and filled with something I couldn't quite place. Sadness, fear, or something else entirely. She walked up to the taxi and opened the door without a word, slipping into the back seat. The air inside the cab immediately grew colder, the kind of cold that sinks into your bones. "Where to?" I asked, glancing at her in the rearview mirror. "Downtown," she replied, her voice soft but clear. almost melodic. There was something about it that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up, but I couldn't put my finger on why. I nodded and started driving, trying to focus on the road and not on the strange passenger in my back seat. The rain continued to pour, the wipers swishing back and forth in a hypnotic rhythm. The city lights reflected off the wet streets, creating an otherworldly glow. As we drove, I noticed something odd. The woman didn't seem wet, despite the rain. Her dress was dry, and there wasn't a drop of water on her hair or skin. I chalked it up to the brief time she had spent outside, but it still nagged at me, a small detail that didn't make sense. We rode in silence for a while, the only sound the hum of the engine and the steady beat of the rain. I tried to make small talk to ease the tension that was building inside me. "Been out late?" I asked, my eyes flicking to the mirror. "Yes," she replied, her voice even softer now, almost a whisper. "I was waiting for someone." "Looks like you got caught in the rain," I said, hoping to keep the conversation going. She didn't answer, just stared out the window, her face expressionless. The city lights flickered across her features, casting strange shadows that made her look almost ethereal. I felt a shiver run down my spine. There was something about her that wasn't right, something I couldn't explain. The unease I'd felt earlier was growing stronger, turning into a cold knot of fear in my gut. As we neared downtown, she suddenly spoke again. "You believe in ghosts?" The question caught me off guard, and I hesitated before answering. "I don't know," I said honestly. "I've heard stories, but I've never seen one myself." She smiled, then a small, sad smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Most people don't believe," she said, "until they see one." I didn't know how to respond to that, so I stayed quiet, focusing on the road ahead. But my mind was racing, trying to make sense of what she had said. We were nearing her destination, a large, old building that had once been a grand hotel, but was now abandoned and falling into ruin. It loomed ahead of us, dark and foreboding, a stark contrast to the bright lights of the surrounding city. "This is it," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I pulled up to the curb, and she sat there for a moment, staring at the building as if lost in thought. Then she turned to me, her dark eyes locking onto mine in the mirror. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice soft but with an edge that sent a chill through me. "You're welcome," I replied, trying to sound casual, but my voice came out strained. She reached into her purse and pulled out a few bills, placing them on the seat beside her. Then, without another word, she opened the door and stepped out into the rain. I watched as she walked toward the building, her figure growing smaller and smaller in the rearview mirror. She didn't look back, just kept walking until she disappeared into the shadows. I sat there for a moment, trying to shake off the unease that had settled over me. The air in the cab was still cold, and I felt a strange heaviness in my chest. I reached over to grab the money she had left, and that's when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The bills were old, really old. They were crisp and new, but the design was unlike anything I had seen before, like something out of a history book. I stared at them, my mind racing, trying to make sense of it, and then I noticed the smell. It was faint at first, but it grew stronger as I held the bills. It was the scent of earth, of something buried deep underground. For a long time, I dropped the money, my hands trembling. My heart was pounding in my chest, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I wanted to get out of there, to drive as far away from that place as possible. But something made me look back one last time. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing at the entrance to the building, staring at me. Her face was pale, almost ghostly, and her eyes, they were no longer sad. They were filled with something else, something dark and menacing. I didn't wait to see what she would do next. I slammed the car into gear and sped away, my tires screeching on the wet pavement. I didn't stop until I was back in the busy part of town, where the lights were bright and the streets were crowded with people. It took me a long time to calm down, to stop shaking. I tried to rationalize what had happened, to convince myself that it was just my imagination, that the woman was just a regular passenger. But deep down I knew better. I never drove in that part of town again. I couldn't. Every time I thought about that night, about the woman and her dark eyes, I felt a cold fear grip my heart. I told a few of my fellow drivers about it, but they just laughed it off, saying I was spooked by an old building and a weird passenger. But I know what I saw. I know that there are things in this world that can't be explained, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. And I know that one rainy night in November, I came face to face with one of them. I had always been the type of person who enjoys solitude. There was something calming about being alone, away from the constant noise of the city, where the only sounds were the wind rustling through the trees and the occasional call of a distant bird. That's why, when I was offered the chance to stay in a remote cabin deep in the woods for a week, I jumped at the opportunity. The cabin belonged to a friend of mine who had inherited it from his grandfather. It was old, built from sturdy logs, and nestled in a clearing surrounded by dense forest. The nearest town was miles away, and there was no cell service or internet, just me, the cabin, and the wilderness. I arrived late in the afternoon, just as the sun was beginning to set. The cabin was exactly as I had imagined it, rustic and cozy, with a stone fireplace, creaky wooden floors, and large windows that looked out onto the forest. I spent the first hour unpacking and settling in, enjoying the peace and quiet. As night fell, I lit a fire in the fireplace and settled into an old armchair with a book. The cabin was warm and inviting, and the crackling of the fire was the only sound in the room. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and rattling the windows. But inside, I felt safe and content. That sense of safety didn't last long. It was around midnight when I first heard a faint scratching sound coming from somewhere outside the cabin. At first I thought it was just the wind or a branch brushing against the side of the building. But as the minutes passed, the scratching grew louder, more insistent, as if something was trying to get inside. I put down my book and listened, my heart beginning to race. The sound was coming from the front door, a steady, rhythmic scratching, like claws scraping against wood. I stood up slowly, my eyes fixed on the door, and the scratching stopped. For a moment there was silence. I took a step toward the door, my hand reaching for the knob, when suddenly there was a loud bang, something heavy slamming against the door, rattling it in its frame. I stumbled back, my pulse pounding in my ears. The fire in the fireplace flickered, casting eerie shadows across the room. I didn't know what to do. I was miles away from anyone, with no way to call for help. The door shook again, as if whatever was outside was trying to force its way in. My mind raced, trying to think of what could be out there, a bear, maybe, or a wolf. But something about the way it moved, the way it scratched at the door, felt wrong. It didn't move like an animal. It moved like something that shouldn't exist. I grabbed a poker from the fireplace, holding it in front of me like a weapon. As I approached the door, the banging stopped, and for a moment there was nothing but silence. I held my breath, waiting, listening. Then, without warning, the door burst open, slamming against the wall with a force that knocked me off my feet. I scrambled back, raising the poker defensively, but there was nothing there, just the open door swinging on its hinges. The wind howled through the opening, bringing with it the scent of pine and earth. I pushed myself up, my heart racing, and moved cautiously toward the door. I looked outside, expecting to see something, anything, but there was nothing. The clearing was empty, the trees swaying gently in the wind. I stepped out onto the porch, the cold night air biting at my skin, and peered into the darkness. The forest was silent, almost unnervingly so. I shut the door, bolting it this time, and returned to the safety of the cabin. But the feeling of unease lingered. I couldn't shake the sense that I wasn't alone, that something had been watching me, stalking me from the shadows. The rest of the night passed in a blur of anxiety and sleeplessness. Every creak of the cabin, every gust of wind, set my nerves on edge. I sat in the armchair, the poker still clutched in my hands, staring at the door, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. When morning finally came, I was exhausted, my body aching from tension. The events of the night felt like a bad dream, but the open door and the scratches on the wood were proof that it had been all too real. I spent the day trying to convince myself that it was just an animal, that there was nothing supernatural about it. But deep down I knew that wasn't true. I stayed in the cabin for the rest of the week, but I never felt at ease. The nights were the worst. Every sound, every shadow filled me with dread. I never saw whatever it was that had visited me that first night, but I could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for the right moment to strike. On the last night of my stay, as I was packing my things, I found something that chilled me to the bone. Carved into the wood of the front door, just beneath the scratches, were 3 words. I will return. I left the cabin at first light, driving away without looking back. I haven't spoken to my friend about what happened, and I don't plan to. Some things are better left unspoken, better left in the darkness where they belong. But I'll never forget that week, never forget the feeling of being watched, of being hunted by something that didn't belong in this world. And I'll never forget the promise carved into the door, because I know that whatever it wasn't done with me yet. I was never one to believe in the supernatural. As a trucker, my life was grounded in reality, just the long stretches of highway, the hum of the engine, and the occasional stop at a trucker's diner. But all that changed during one haul, a journey that would leave me questioning everything I thought I knew. This story isn't just a tale of a spooky encounter. It's a recounting of the night that nearly drove me off the road, out of my mind. I had been on the road for over 12 hours, hauling a load of lumber from the sawmills up in Oregon down to a construction site in Nevada. The route was familiar. I had driven it countless times. Blackwood Mountain, however, was a stretch I usually avoided. Known for its treacherous curves and dense forests, it was a road that even the most seasoned truckers took with caution. But I was running behind schedule, and taking Blackwood Mountain was the only way to make up for lost time. As I began the ascent, the sky was already darkening. Thick clouds loomed overhead, threatening a downpour. The road, narrow and winding, snaked through the forest with towering pines on either side that seemed to close in around me. There was something unsettling about the way the trees seemed to watch, their shadow stretching out like skeletal fingers across the asphalt. The first sign that something was wrong came when my radio crackled to life. It was late, and I wasn't expecting anyone to be on the airwaves, but then I heard a voice, faint and distorted, cutting through the static. Turn back, it whispered. I frowned, adjusting the dial, but the voice was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Probably just interference, I thought, shaking it off. But a knot of unease began to tighten in my chest. The rain started as a light drizzle, but soon it was coming down in sheets, the windshield wipers struggling to keep up. Visibility dropped to almost nothing, and I slowed the rig to a crawl. That's when I saw the headlights of another vehicle in my rearview mirror. They appeared suddenly, as if out of nowhere, and regaining on me fast, I kept to my lane, expecting the car to overtake me. But it didn't. Instead, it stayed right on my tail, its high beams glaring into my cab, blinding me. I squinted against the light, trying to focus on the road ahead, but the car didn't budge. It was as if it was trying to force me off the road. I tapped the brakes, hoping to signal the driver to back off, but they didn't. My heart raced as I gripped the wheel tighter. Who in their right mind would be driving so recklessly in these conditions? But then, as suddenly as they had appeared, the headlights swerved sharply to the right and vanished into the trees. I blinked, staring at the spot where the car had disappeared. There was no way any vehicle could have taken that turn without crashing into the trees. I slowed to a stop, peering into the darkness, but there was no sign of the car. It was as if it had been swallowed by the forest, shaken. I continued driving, my eyes darting to the rearview mirror every few seconds. The rain began to let up, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. The road seemed different now, as if it had stretched out longer, the curves more pronounced. It was as if I was driving deeper into the mountain, away from any sense of reality. Then, just as I rounded a particularly sharp bend, I saw it, an old truck, jackknifed across the road. I slammed on the brakes, the rig skidding on the wet asphalt, coming to a stop just inches from the wreck. My heart pounded as I stared at the truck. It was a model from the 1950s, rusted and beaten up, with the name Blackwood Haulers faintly visible on the side. There was no sign of a driver, no indication that anyone had been inside recently. The truck looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out into the rain, the cold wind biting through my jacket. I approached the wreck cautiously, my boots squelching in the mud. As I got closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The cab of the truck was covered in deep scratches, as if something had clawed its way out. The windows were shattered from the inside, glass littering the ground. I shone my flashlight into the cab, half expecting to see some wild animal, but it was empty. I took a step back, my instincts screaming at me to get back in my rig and leave. But something caught my eye. On the ground, just beyond the truck, was a trail of footprints. They were large, too large to be human, and they led off into the woods. The prints were deep, like whatever had made them was heavy, and they were spaced far apart, as if the creature had been running. My breath caught in my throat as I followed the trail with my flashlight. The prints led deeper into the forest, disappearing into the undergrowth. I should have turned back then, gotten in my truck, and driven away as fast as I could. But something drew me forward, a morbid curiosity that overrode my fear. I followed the trail for a few more yards before the forest fell silent. The rain had stopped, and the only sound was the crunch of leaves under my boots. The trail ended at the edge of a clearing, and in the center that clearing was a cabin, old and decrepit, with its roof caved in and its walls covered in moss. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I approached the cabin. The door was hanging off its hinges, creaking in the wind. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the flashlight switch, before stepping inside. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I moved through the small, dark space. The cabin was empty, save for a few broken pieces of furniture and an old wood stove. But the air was thick with the smell of decay, a stench that made my stomach turn. I covered my nose with my sleeve, shining the light around the room. That's when I saw it, a set of old photographs pinned to the wall, yellowed with age. They were of men, all wearing the same trucker's uniform, standing in front of the same old truck I had seen on the road. Each man looked serious, their faces gaunt and tired. But there was something wrong with the photos, something that made my skin crawl. The men's eyes, they were all blacked out, as if someone had taken a marker to them. But it wasn't just that. There were deep scratches across the photos, the same kind of marks I had seen on the truck, as if something had tried to claw its way out of the pictures themselves. I backed away from the wall, my heart racing. Something was very wrong with this place, and I knew I needed to get out. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I heard it a low kettle growl coming from behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. But there was nothing there, just the empty cabin and the sound of my own breathing. I took a step forward, my flashlight flickering, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the night, moving across the wall. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of the cabin, running back towards the road as fast as I could. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees whispering in a language I couldn't understand. But I didn't stop, didn't look back until I reached my rig. I jumped in, locking the doors and starting the engine. The headlights illuminated the road ahead, but there was no sign of the old truck or the creature that had left those prints. I threw the rig into gear and sped down the mountain, my hands trembling on the wheel. But it wasn't until I was miles away, back on the main highway, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I pulled over at the first truck stop I found, collapsing in the driver's seat. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what I had just experienced, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me, something that was still out there, lurking in the shadows. I never took Blackwood Mountain again after that night. I stuck to the longer routes, even if it meant losing time. But every now and then, when I'm on a dark stretch of highway, I think about that night. I think about the truck, the cabin, and the thing that was chasing me, and I wonder if one day it will find me again. Scratched into the wood of the cabin, just below the windowsill, were a series of symbols. They were small, barely noticeable, but they were there, carved into the wood with a precision that was unnerving. I ran my fingers over them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They looked like runes or some kind of ancient script, something I had never seen before. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I stayed up, sitting by the fire, staring at the symbols and trying to convince myself that there was a rational explanation for all of this. But deep down, I knew that whatever had made those marks wasn't something I could easily explain away. The next morning, I drove into town to ask around about the previous owner of the cabin. I figured that if anyone knew anything about the symbols, it would be the locals. I started at the diner, where the older residents gathered for breakfast every morning. When I asked about the man who had owned the cabin, the conversation at the table stopped. The older folks exchanged glances, and I could feel the tension in the air. Finally, one of them, a woman in her 70s, spoke up. He was a good man, kept to himself mostly, she said, her voice low. But he was always wary, like he was afraid of something. We never knew what, but there were rumors. Rumors, I asked, leaning in. She nodded. They say he was hiding from something in the woods. He never talked about it, but he was always careful, always watching. Some folks thought he was crazy, but I don't think so. There was something out there, something he was trying to protect himself from. I asked her about the symbols, and her face paled. "You've seen them?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, and she shook her head. "Those are warnings," she said, "markings to keep whatever it is away. If you've seen them, it means it knows you're there." I felt a chill run down my spine. What should I do? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Leave," she said, her eyes wide with fear. "Get out of there before it's too late." I left the diner feeling more unsettled than ever. The woman's words echoed in my mind as I drove back to the cabin. Part of me wanted to pack up and leave, to get as far away from that place as possible. But another part of me, the part that had always been drawn to the unknown, refused to give in to fear. That night I sat by the fire again, staring at the symbols, trying to make sense of everything. I told myself that I was being paranoid, that there was a logical explanation for all of this. But as the night wore on, the sense of dread grew stronger. Around midnight, the scratching started again. This time, it was louder, more aggressive. I could hear it moving around the cabin, circling it, as if whatever was out there was searching for a way in. My heart raced as I grabbed the flashlight and the shotgun I kept by the door. I wasn't going to let whatever it was scare me away. I threw open the door and stepped outside, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The scratching stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. I stood there, my breath visible in the cold night air, my finger on the trigger of the shotgun, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The forest was still, the trees swaying gently in the breeze. I was about to turn back when I heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from the darkness, deep within the trees. It was a sound that I had never heard before, a sound that didn't belong to any animal I knew of. I took a step back, my hands shaking, and the growl grew louder, more menacing. Whatever it was getting closer. I could feel its presence, the weight of it pressing down on me, making it hard to breathe. I had always been drawn to the woods ever since I was a child. There was something about the solitude, the towering trees, and the way the sunlight filtered through the leaves that made me feel at peace. So when I became an adult and had the opportunity to buy a small piece of land deep in the forest, I didn't hesitate. It was perfect, a secluded cabin surrounded by acres of untouched wilderness, far from the noise and chaos of the city. The cabin itself was simple, but it had everything I needed. It was built by the previous owner, a man who had lived there for nearly 40 years before he passed away. The locals spoke of him as a bit of a hermit, someone who kept to himself and rarely ventured into town. They also mentioned that he was always on edge, as if he was constantly expecting something terrible to happen. I dismissed it as small-town gossip, the kind of stories people make up to entertain themselves. The first few weeks in the cabin were blissful. I spent my days hiking through the forest, exploring the land, and getting to know the area. The nights were quiet, with only the sound of the wind in the trees and the occasional hoot of an owl to keep me company. It was everything I had ever wanted. Then, one evening, as I was sitting on the porch watching the sun set, I noticed something strange. The birds had suddenly gone silent, and the air felt heavy, as if a storm was approaching. But there were no clouds in the sky, just a deepening darkness that seemed to creep in from the edges of the forest. I brushed it off as nothing more than the onset of night, and went inside to prepare dinner. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched, that something was lurking just beyond the tree line, hidden in the shadows. I tried to ignore it, convincing myself that it was just my imagination. But when I went to bed that night, I found it impossible to sleep. The cabin, which had always felt like a sanctuary, now felt like a trap. Every creak of the wood, every rustle of the leaves outside, sent a jolt of fear through me. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the silence, until finally exhaustion took over, and I drifted off. I woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something scratching at the walls of the cabin. It was a faint, almost delicate sound, like the claws of a small animal. but it sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in bed, holding my breath, listening. The scratching continued, moving along the outside of the cabin, as if whatever it was circling the building. My first thought was that it was a raccoon or some other nocturnal animal. But the more I listened, the more I realized that the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. It wasn't the random scratching of an animal. It was something else, something with intent. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight I kept on the nightstand. My hands were shaking as I made my way to the front door. The scratching stopped as I reached for the doorknob, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed down on me like a weight. I hesitated for a moment, then threw open the door, shining the flashlight into the darkness. The beam of light cut through the night, illuminating the trees and the underbrush. But there was nothing there, no sign of any animal, no movement, just the stillness of the forest. I stepped outside, the cold night air biting at my skin, and slowly circled the cabin. The beam of the flashlight swept over the ground, the walls, the trees, but there was nothing out of place, nothing to explain the scratching I had heard. I was about to turn back when something caught my eye, faint, almost invisible, but unmistakable. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind me. I bolted it and leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest. The growling continued, growing louder, more aggressive, until it was right outside the door. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying than the growling. I stood there, my back against the door, listening, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. The night was still, the only sound the crackling of the fire. I didn't move from that spot for hours, too afraid to even breathe. When the first light of dawn finally crept through the windows, I knew that I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my things and left the cabin that morning, not looking back. I didn't care about the land, the peace, or the solitude anymore. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to face. I drove back to the city, back to the noise and the chaos, where I felt safe. I've never been back to the cabin, and I don't plan to. But sometimes, in the quiet of the night, when the wind howls through the trees, I can still hear that growl, that low, menacing sound that haunts my dreams. And I know that somewhere, deep in the woods, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. Being a park ranger has its perks. You get to spend your days surrounded by nature, breathing in the fresh air, and feeling the serenity that comes from being far away from the hustle and bustle of city life. But with all the beauty and tranquility, there's an undercurrent of something darker, something ancient and wild that lurks in the deepest parts of the forest. Most people don't know about it, and most rangers won't talk about it. But I learned the hard way that some things are better left undiscovered. It was late September, and the first hints of autumn were beginning to show in the forest. The leaves had started to turn shades of gold and red, and there was a crispness to the air that hinted at the colder days to come. I had been a park ranger for over 10 years, stationed at a national park in the Pacific Northwest. The area was known for its dense forests, rugged mountains, and remote trails that could take you days away from civilization. It was beautiful, but it was also unforgiving. That evening, I was on my usual patrol, a routine check of one of the more remote trails that ran deep into the heart of the forest. It was a trail that didn't see much foot traffic, mostly used by experienced hikers and those looking for solitude. The kind of place where you could walk for hours without seeing another soul. As I set out, the sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. I had a thermos of coffee, a flashlight, and my radio. The hike was supposed to be uneventful, a simple out and back to make sure everything was in order before the end of my shift. About an hour in, I reached a clearing that marked the halfway point of my patrol. The clearing was an eerie place at dusk. The trees around it were tall and ancient, their branches twisting together to form a canopy that blocked out most of the light. The air was still, and the usual sounds of the forest birds chirping, leaves rustling were absent. As if the entire area was holding its breath, I took a moment to sip my coffee, enjoying the cool air and the solitude. But as I stood there, a feeling of unease began to creep over me. It was subtle at first, just a nagging sensation at the back of my mind, like I was being watched. I scanned the tree line, but there was nothing, no movement, no sounds, just the oppressive silence. I shook off the feeling and started back down the trail. I hadn't gone more than a few steps when I heard a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from the direction of the clearing. I stopped in my tracks, my heart skipping a beat. I've heard plenty of animal sounds in my time, but this was different. It wasn't a bear or a cougar. It was something else, something I couldn't quite place. I turned around, shining my flashlight back toward the clearing. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty clearing, surrounded by trees. The growl came again, louder this time, and I felt the hair on the back of my neck stand up. My instincts told me to leave, to get out of there as fast as I could. But I was a ranger, and it was my job to investigate. So, against my better judgment, I stepped back into the clearing, flashlight in hand, and started toward the source of the sound. As I neared the center of the clearing, the growling stopped, replaced by a heavy, oppressive silence. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel my pulse quicken as I scanned the area, trying to figure out where the sound had come from. That's when I saw it dot at the edge of the clearing, partially hidden by the shadows. Was a large, dark shape. It was standing on two legs, its massive form blending almost perfectly with the surrounding trees. My flashlight caught a brief glimpse of its eyes, large, glowing red orbs that seemed to burn with an unnatural light. I froze, my mind struggling to comprehend what I was seeing. It was humanoid in shape, but far too large, too monstrous to be anything human. Its body was covered in matted fur, and its arms were long, almost reaching the ground. But it was the eyes that held me, those burning red eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness and stared directly into my soul. I wanted to run, to get as far away from that thing as possible. But I was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. The creature let out another low growl, and I felt the sound vibrate through my chest, reverberating in my bones. Finally, my survival instincts kicked in, and I did the only thing I could. I turned and ran. I sprinted down the trail, my flashlight bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps crashing through the underbrush, getting closer and closer. I didn't dare look back. I just kept running, my breath coming in ragged gasps, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness closing in around me, but I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. After what felt like an eternity, I burst out of the forest and onto the gravel road that led back to the ranger station. I didn't slow down until I reached the station, slamming the door behind me and collapsing against it, my body shaking with adrenaline and fear. For a long time, I just sat there, trying to catch my breath, trying to make sense of what had happened. I didn't tell anyone about the creature. Who would believe me? I wasn't even sure if I believed it myself. But I knew one thing for certain: I wasn't going back to that clearing. I avoided that trail for the rest of the season, and when the park closed for the winter, I put in a request to be transferred to a different location. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had seen. It's been years since that night, and I've worked in parks all across the country since then, but the memory of that creature, those burning red eyes, still haunts me. I've done my best to forget, to move on, but every now and then, when I'm out in the woods alone, I can feel that same oppressive silence, that same feeling of being watched, and I know that somewhere out there, in the dark, deep woods, that creature is still lurking, waiting. I don't know what it is or where it came from, but I do know one thing: I'll never forget the night I encountered it, and I'll never go back. I never believed in ghosts. As a social worker, my life was dedicated to helping others, grounded in the harsh realities of the world: abuse, neglect, and the heartbreaking struggles of children left to fend for themselves. But one case, one place, changed everything I thought I knew. Maplewood Orphanage was an old, sprawling estate on the outskirts of town. It had been abandoned for years, the once grand building now a decaying relic of a bygone era. But recently it had been bought by a private foundation with plans to restore it and reopen it as a home for children in need. I was assigned to assess the site, to determine if it was fit for habitation. The drive out to Maplewood was uneventful, the long country road winding through fields and forests. As I approached the orphanage, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The building loomed ahead, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at me. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rotting wood. I parked my car in the overgrown driveway and stepped out, the crunch of gravel underfoot echoing in the stillness. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound reverberating through the empty halls. Inside, the orphanage was a maze of rooms and corridors, the walls peeling with age, the floorboards creaking with every step. I made my way through the building, checking each room, taking notes on the repairs that would be needed. But as I walked through the silent halls, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. It started with the whispers. At first, I thought it was just the wind, the old building settling after years of neglect. But the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were voices, soft and mournful, echoing through the halls. I stopped in my tracks, straining to listen, but the voices faded away, leaving only the sound of my own breathing. I shook my head, dismissing it as my imagination, and continued with my assessment. But the unease grew with every step I took. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the building itself was alive, breathing, watching me. As I entered the main hallway, I noticed something strange: a set of footprints in the dust, leading down the hall. They were small, like those of a child. My heart skipped a beat as I followed the footprints, my steps echoing in the silence. The footprints led to a door at the end of the hall, a heavy wooden door that looked out of place among the other, more modern fixtures. I hesitated for a moment, my hand on the doorknob, before turning it and pushing the door open. Inside was a small, dimly lit room, the walls lined with shelves filled with dusty old books and toys. In the center of the room was a crib, ancient and worn, with a tattered blanket draped over the side. My breath caught in my throat as I approached the crib, my heart pounding in my chest. Inside the crib was a doll, its porcelain face cracked and worn, its glass eyes staring up at the ceiling. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. Next to the doll, lying on the mattress, was a letter yellowed with age, addressed to Mother. I picked up the letter, my hands trembling as I unfolded the fragile paper. The handwriting was neat, almost childlike, and the words sent a chill down my spine. "Dear Mother, why did you leave me? I waited and waited, but you never came back. The other children said you were gone, but I know you'll come for me. I'll wait forever if I have to. Love, Emily. My hand shook as I read the letter again, the words blurring in my vision. Emily, the name rang a bell, a distant memory of a case I had read about years ago. A little girl who had been abandoned at Maplewood Orphanage, who had died under mysterious circumstances. The details were vague, lost to time, but the sadness of her story had stayed with me. I placed the letter back in the crib, my mind racing. This room, this crib, it was as if time had stood still, preserving a moment of heartache and loss. I turned to leave, but as I reached the door, I felt it a cold breeze brushing past me, followed by the sound of soft footsteps behind me. I spun around, my flashlight beam sweeping across the room, but there was nothing there, just the crib, the doll, and the letter. I backed out of the room, closing the door behind me, my heart racing. The whispers returned, louder this time, surrounding me, filling the hall with their mournful tones. I could make out words now, pleas for help, cries of anguish. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly. My breath came out in puffs of mist as I hurried down the hall, the whispers growing louder, more desperate. I reached the front door, fumbling with the handle in my haste to get out. But the door wouldn't budge. It was as if something was holding it shut, keeping me trapped inside. Panic set in as I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the only response was the chorus of voices growing louder, echoing through the empty halls. I turned around, my back pressed against the door, and that's when I saw her, a little girl, standing at the end of the hall, her dress tattered and dirty, her eyes wide with fear. She was pale, almost translucent, and as I stared at her, she raised a hand pointing towards the door I had just left. "Help her," she whispered, her voice trembling. "She's still waiting." My blood ran cold as I realized what she meant. Emily, the little girl from the letter. She was still here, trapped in this place, waiting for a mother who would never come. The little girl's figure began to fade, her form dissolving into the shadows as the whispers grew louder, more urgent. I had to help her, had to do something to free her from this torment. But how? I didn't know where to start, didn't know what I was dealing with. All I knew was that I couldn't leave her here, not like this. I turned and ran back down the hall, back to the room with the crib. The door was open, the dim light casting long shadows across the floor. As I entered the room, the whispers reached a fever pitch, a cacophony of voices filling the air. I rushed to the crib, grabbing the letter and the doll, hoping that somehow they held the key to freeing her. But as I held them in my hands, the room grew darker, the shadows closing in around me. The air was thick with a presence, something malevolent and cold, something that wanted to keep Emily here, trapped forever. I had to act fast. I knelt beside the crib, placing the letter and the doll back inside, and closed my eyes, sending up a silent prayer. "Emily," I whispered, "if you can hear me, it's time to go. You don't have to wait anymore. It's time to move on." The air grew colder still, the darkness pressing in. But then, slowly, the whispers began to fade. The temperature started to rise, the oppressive weight lifting from my chest. I opened my eyes to see the room bathed in a soft, warm light, and in the center of that light, a figure appeared, a woman, her face kind and gentle, her eyes filled with love. She reached out a hand, and from the shadows, the little girl emerged, her face lighting up with joy as she ran into the woman's arms. I watched in awe as the two figures embraced, the light growing brighter, filling the room with warmth and peace. And then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, the room returning to its former state. I stood there for a long moment, my heart pounding in my chest, the reality of what I had just witnessed sinking in. Emily was free, her spirit finally at rest. The whispers were gone, the air no longer cold and oppressive. The orphanage was silent, but it was a peaceful silence, a quiet that spoke of closure, of an ending that had finally come. I left Maplewood Orphanage that day, the weight of what I had experienced heavy on my shoulders. I never spoke of it to anyone, never mentioned the little girl or the mother who had come to take her home, but I knew deep down that what I had seen was real, that there are things in this world that we can't explain, things that exist beyond the veil of our understanding. And every now and then, when I pass by that old building, I think of Emily, of the long years she spent waiting, and I hope that wherever she is now, she has finally found the peace she was searching for. It was the middle of winter, and I was living alone in a small one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. The building was old, probably built in the 70s, with creaky floors and thin walls. It wasn't the most secure place, but it was all I could afford at the time. I worked the late shift at a local diner, which meant I usually got home around midnight, sometimes even later if it was a particularly busy night. By the time I got home, the entire building was quiet, with most of the other tenants fast asleep. One night, after a particularly long shift, I came home exhausted. The diner had been packed, and I was on my feet for hours, dealing with rude customers and cleaning up after them. All I wanted was to take a hot shower, eat something, and collapse into bed. When I walked into my apartment, everything seemed normal. I locked the door behind me, tossed my keys on the kitchen counter, and headed to the bathroom to wash away the grime of the day. As I stood under the hot water, letting the steam envelop me, I tried to relax, but something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a nagging feeling at the back of my mind that I couldn't shake. I chalked it up to being overtired and tried to push it aside. After my shower, I threw on some pajamas and went to the kitchen to fix a quick meal. The refrigerator hummed softly as I pulled out some leftovers, and the sound of the microwave heating them up filled the otherwise silent apartment. I leaned against the counter, staring at the digital clock on the stove as it ticked over to 12:30 a.m. I was so tired I could barely keep my eyes open. I grabbed my food and headed to the living room, planning to eat while watching TV for a bit before bed. As I walked into the room, I noticed something that stopped me in my tracks. The front door, which I was certain I had locked when I came in, was slightly ajar. A cold draft of air was seeping in from the hallway, making the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. I stood there, frozen, trying to process what I was seeing. Had I forgotten to lock it? No, I was sure I had locked it. I always double-checked, especially living in this neighborhood. My heart started to race as I slowly put the plate of food down on the coffee table and took a step toward the door. As I reached out to close it, I noticed something else, a shadow moving just beyond the door frame. My breath caught in my throat as I realized that someone was standing there just out of sight in the hallway. I pulled my hand back, not wanting to alert whoever it was to my presence. I backed away from the door, my mind racing. There was no way out of the apartment except through that door, and I didn't have a landline to call for help. My cell phone was in the bedroom, charging, but there was no way I could get to it without making noise. I was trapped. I moved as quietly as I could toward the kitchen, hoping to find something I could use to defend myself. My hands were shaking as I grabbed the biggest knife I could find from the drawer. I clutched it tightly, trying to steady my breathing and listen for any sound from the hallway for what felt like an eternity. There was nothing but silence. Then I heard a soft creak, the sound of a floorboard shifting under someone's weight. Whoever it was They were in the apartment now. My grip tightened on the knife as I pressed myself against the kitchen counter, trying to stay out of sight. My mind was racing with thoughts of what I should do. Should I confront them? Should I hide and hope they don't find me? Every option seemed terrifying. The sound of footsteps grew louder as they moved through the living room, heading in my direction. I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears, and I fought to keep my breathing steady. I knew that if they found me, I would have to defend myself, but the thought of actually having to use the knife made me feel sick. Then the footsteps stopped. I could feel the tension in the air, the oppressive silence pressing down on me. Whoever it was, they were standing just outside the kitchen, and I knew it was only a matter of seconds before they found me. My mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, each one more terrifying than the last. I thought about the possibility of being attacked, of being overpowered, and the thought sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. I knew I had to do something, and fast out in one swift motion, I darted out from behind the counter, knife raised, ready to defend myself. But as I rounded the corner, I was met with an empty living room. The front door was wide open, swinging slightly in the cold breeze. Whoever had been there was gone. I stood there, panting, my heart still racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I slowly lowered the knife, my mind reeling. Had I imagined the whole thing? Was it possible that the stress and exhaustion had gotten to me? But the open door and the cold draft that filled the room told me otherwise. I quickly closed and locked the door, this time triple-checking it to make sure it was secure. I backed away from it, still holding the knife, and grabbed my cell phone from the bedroom. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely dial, but I managed to call the police. When they arrived, I was still in a state of shock. They searched the apartment and the surrounding area, but found no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there. The officer in charge tried to reassure me, saying it was probably just a case of someone trying doors in the building, looking for an easy target, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than that whoever had been in my apartment had been watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The police left after taking my statement, but I couldn't sleep that night. I sat on the couch, clutching the knife, staring at the door, and listening for any sound that might indicate someone was trying to get in again. Every creak of the building, every gust of wind outside sent a fresh wave of fear through me. The next day, I called my landlord and asked to have the locks changed. He agreed, but it did little to ease my anxiety. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that whoever had been in my apartment might come back. Over the next few days, I barely slept. I jumped at every sound, every shadow, constantly on edge. I even considered moving out, but I couldn't afford to break my lease, and finding a new place on such short notice was nearly impossible. Then, one night, about a week after the break-in, it happened again. I came home from work, exhausted as usual, and immediately noticed that something was off. The front door was closed, but it wasn't locked. My stomach dropped as I pushed it open, knife already in hand, and stepped inside. The apartment was dark, and for a moment I thought maybe I had forgotten to lock it in my exhaustion. But as I moved further into the room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the coffee table, in the exact spot where I had placed my plate of food the night of the first break-in, was a single folded piece of paper. My hands trembled as I reached for it, my heart pounding in my chest. I unfolded the paper, and my breath caught in my throat. Written in neat, precise handwriting were the words, "I'm watching you." I dropped the paper as if it had burned me, my mind reeling. I looked around the room, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows, but there was no one there. I was alone, but the feeling of being watched was stronger than ever. I grabbed my phone and called the police again, my voice shaking as I told them what had happened. They arrived within minutes, but once again they found no sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there besides the note. The officer in charge, the same one from the first break-in, looked at me with concern. "Are you sure you don't have any enemies? Someone who might want to scare you?" he asked. I shook my head, tears of frustration and fear welling up in my eyes. "No, I don't know anyone who would do this. I don't know what's going on, but I can't stay here anymore." "I can't," he nodded, sympathetic. "I understand. We'll do everything we can to find out who's doing this, but in the meantime, it might be a good idea to stay with a friend or a family member just until things calm down." I nodded, knowing he was right. I couldn't stay in that apartment another night. I packed a bag and left, not looking back. I stayed with a friend for the next few weeks, too afraid to go back to my own place. I only returned during the day, when I knew there would be people around to collect my things. Eventually, I found a new apartment in a different part of town, one with better security and a doorman. I never found out who was behind the break-ins or the note, and the police never made any arrests, but the fear never really went away. Even now, in my new place, I'm constantly checking the locks, jumping at every sound, every shadow. The memory of that night, of the feeling of being watched, still haunts me, and I know deep down that whoever it was, they're still out there, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike again. When I was growing up, there was a place on the outskirts of town that everyone whispered about. It was an old, abandoned asylum, left to rot for decades, surrounded by a thick forest that seemed to swallow the building whole. Kids dared each other to go near it, but no one ever did, at least not until we got older and more reckless. It was the summer after we graduated high school, a time when we felt invincible and stupidly brave. My friends Tom, Sarah, Mike, and I had heard all the stories about the asylum. People said it was haunted, cursed even. Some claimed they heard screams coming from the building at night or saw strange lights flickering in the windows. Others spoke of the patients who had died there, their souls trapped within its decaying walls, never finding peace. Of course, we didn't believe any of it. We were too young and too eager for a thrill. So one hot July evening, we decided to break in and see the place for ourselves. We met at the edge of the forest, just as the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the overgrown path that led to the asylum. The air was thick with humidity, and the cicadas droned on, filling the silence with their incessant buzzing. Tom had brought a flashlight, Mike had a couple of beers, and Sarah carried a camera. We figured we'd spend an hour or so exploring, maybe take some pictures, and then head back to town, laughing about how we'd conquered the big, bad asylum. As we made our way through the trees, the building loomed into view, dark, massive, and foreboding. The brickwork was crumbling, the windows were shattered, and ivy had crept up the sides, as if nature was trying to reclaim the structure. A rusted gate hung crookedly on its hinges, the metal groaning as we pushed it open. We stood there for a moment, staring up at the asylum, the excitement we'd felt earlier slowly giving way to something else. The place had a presence, a heavy, oppressive atmosphere that seemed to push down on us, making it hard to breathe. But we weren't about to back out now. Tom was the first to step inside, his flashlight cutting through the darkness as he led the way. The interior was worse than we'd imagined, damp, moldy, and filled with debris. Broken furniture, old medical equipment, and papers were scattered across the floor. Covered in layers of dust and grime, the smell was overwhelming, a mix of mildew, decay, and something else, something metallic that lingered in the back of my throat. I tried to ignore it as we made our way down the main corridor, our footsteps echoing in the silence. "This place is a dump," Mike muttered, kicking aside an old wheelchair that was lying on its side. "Yeah, but it's kind of cool, right?" Sarah said, snapping a picture of a broken-down gurney. "Creepy is more like it," I added, glancing nervously at the darkened doorways that lined the hall. Each one seemed to lead into an abyss, the darkness impenetrable even with Tom's flashlight. We continued exploring, moving from room to room. Most were empty, the walls peeling, the floors cracked and uneven. But as we ventured deeper into the building, we started finding signs of the people who had once been there, old patient records, faded photographs, even a few articles of clothing left behind as if the owners had simply vanished. In one room, we found a collection of dusty, old dolls, their glass eyes staring blankly at us from a shelf. In another, there was a tattered straitjacket hanging on a hook, its fabric stained and yellow with age. The further we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the building itself was alive, watching us, waiting for us to make a mistake. The air was thick with tension, and I could feel the weight of the place pressing down on me, filling me with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. "Guys, maybe we should head back," I suggested, my voice wavering slightly. I didn't want to admit it, but I was starting to get scared. "We haven't even seen the basement yet," Tom replied, his voice filled with excitement. "That's where they say the really creepy stuff happened." "I don't know, Tom," Sarah said, glancing nervously at the door that led downstairs. "This place gives me the creeps." Mike, who had been unusually quiet, nodded in agreement. "Maybe we should just call it a night," but Tom was determined, and before we could protest further, he was already heading down the stairs, the beam of his flashlight bobbing with each step. With a heavy sigh, the rest of us followed. The stairs creaked and groaned under our weight, and the air grew colder the further down we went. By the time we reached the bottom, it was freezing, and our breath formed little clouds in front of us. The basement was even darker than the rest of the asylum, the walls covered in black mold that seemed to pulse and breathe. The smell of decay was stronger here, almost unbearable, and I had to cover my nose and mouth to keep from gagging. "Jesus, what happened down here?" Mike whispered, his voice echoing off the damp walls. "No idea," Tom replied, shining his flashlight around the room. "But I bet this is where they kept the really dangerous patients." The basement was a labyrinth of narrow corridors and small, windowless rooms, each one more disturbing than the last. In one, we found rusted chains bolted to the walls, their links thick and heavy, as if they had been used to restrain something or someone stronger than any human. In another, there was an old operating table, its surface stained with something dark and sticky that had long since dried. Instruments lay scattered around it, scalpels, saws, and other tools that looked more suited for torture than surgery. "Let's get out of here," Sarah said, her voice trembling. It was faint at first, like the distant echo of a scream, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it filled the air around us. We stood there, paralyzed, as the sound echoed through the basement, reverberating off the walls. It wasn't a human scream, it was something else, something primal and filled with pain and rage. "What the hell is that?" Mike hissed, his eyes wide with fear. Tom didn't answer. He just stared down the corridor, his flashlight flickering as the batteries began to die. The scream came again, louder this time, and I felt my blood turn to ice. It was coming from the end of the corridor, from a room we hadn't yet explored. "We need to go now," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "But Tom was already moving toward the sound, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Tom, don't," Sarah pleaded, but he ignored her, disappearing into the darkness. We had no choice but to follow, our footsteps echoing loudly as we hurried after him. The scream grew louder, more desperate, and I could feel the walls closing in around us, the darkness becoming almost suffocating. When we reached the room, Tom was standing in the doorway, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. He didn't say a word, just pointed his flashlight into the room. I looked inside and felt my stomach drop. The room was small, barely more than a closet, but the walls were covered in writing, thousands of words scrawled in what looked like blood, the letters uneven and frantic. There were symbols, two strange, twisted shapes that made my head hurt just looking at them. In the center of the room was a figure, a woman, or what was left of her. She was huddled in the corner, her back to us, her body contorted in an unnatural position. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her hair hung in matted clumps. The scream came again, but this time it wasn't distant. It was coming from her, from that thing in the corner. We backed away slowly, too terrified to speak, too horrified to move. But as we did, she turned to face us. Her eyes, those empty, soulless eyes, locked onto mine, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me, as if she was reaching into my very soul. Her mouth opened in a silent scream, her jaw distending unnaturally wide, and I knew he had to get out of there. We turned and ran, our footsteps pounding on the cold, hard floor as we fled the basement. The asylum loomed behind us, dark and silent, as if it had swallowed up whatever had been inside. We never spoke about what we saw that night. We left the town soon after, each of us going our separate ways, trying to forget the horrors he had encountered, but I never could. The memory of that night, of that thing in the asylum, haunts me still. Sometimes in the dead of night, I can still hear her scream, echoing through the darkness, a reminder of the terror that lurks in forgotten places, and I know that some things are better left undisturbed. There's something about the open road that can be both freeing and terrifying. I've been a trucker for over 20 years, and I've seen my fair share of strange things on the highways, things that can't be explained, things that make you question your sanity. But there's one night that stands out above the rest, a night that still sends shivers down my spine whenever I think about it. It was a late autumn evening, and I was hauling a load from Texas to Colorado. The route was familiar, mostly long stretches of highway through desolate countryside, the kind of drive where you can go hours without seeing another vehicle. The sun had set hours ago, and the road was bathed in darkness, illuminated only by the dim glow of my headlights. I was somewhere in the middle of New Mexico, on a stretch of highway that cut through the desert. The landscape was barren, with nothing but scrub brush and cacti as far as the eye could see. It was the kind of place that felt isolated from the rest of the world, like time had forgotten it. I'd been driving for hours, and the monotony of the road was starting to get to me. The hum of the engine, the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt, it all blended together into a kind of hypnotic lullaby. I fought to keep my eyes open, reminding myself that I was on a tight schedule and couldn't afford to stop for the night. As I rounded a bend in the highway, something caught my eye. Up ahead on the side of the road was a figure standing in the darkness. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, maybe a shadow cast by a road sign, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere. She was dressed in a white gown, the kind you might see someone wear to bed, and her long, dark hair hung loose around her shoulders. She was standing perfectly still, facing the road, but not moving. There were no cars around, No signs of a broken-down vehicle, just her, standing there in the darkness. I slowed down as I approached, my curiosity piqued. What was she doing out here? Was she in trouble? I pulled over to the side of the road, my headlights illuminating her figure as I rolled down the window. "Mom, are you okay?" I called out, my voice breaking the silence of the night. She didn't respond. She didn't even acknowledge that I was there. What if she was hurt or lost? I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and got out of the truck, leaving the engine running as I walked toward her. "Mom, do you need help?" I asked again, my voice sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. Still no response. As I got closer, I could see her face more clearly, pale, almost ghostly, with dark circles under her eyes. She looked like she hadn't slept in days, like she was exhausted beyond belief. But there was something else, something about her eyes that made me uneasy. For a moment I thought she was going to ignore me again, but then, slowly, she turned her head to look at me. Her movements were stiff, unnatural, like a puppet being manipulated by invisible strings. When her eyes met mine, I felt a wave of dread wash over me. They were dark, bottomless, and there was something in them that made my skin crawl, something that wasn't human. "I need to get home," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can you take me home?" Her words were flat, devoid of any emotion, but there was something about them that made me feel like I had no choice but to agree. Against my better judgment, I nodded. "Where's home?" I asked, my voice trembling slightly. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she pointed down the highway toward the darkness ahead. "Just keep driving. I'll tell you when we get there." I hesitated, but there was something in her gaze that compelled me to obey. I turned back to the truck, feeling her eyes on me the entire time. As I climbed into the cab, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was making a terrible mistake, but I couldn't bring myself to leave her there either. She got into the passenger seat, moving with that same strange, puppet-like stiffness. As soon as she closed the door, I started the truck and pulled back onto the highway. The road stretched out before us, a ribbon of darkness disappearing into the night. For a long time, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the rumble of the engine and the whine of the tires on the road. I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, trying to make sense of what was happening. I tried to make small talk, asking her where she was from, but she didn't respond. It was like she was in a trance, completely disconnected from reality. After what felt like an eternity, she finally spoke. "Turn here." I looked around, confused. There was no exit, no road, not even a sign, just the empty desert stretching out on either side of the highway. "Turn where?" I asked, glancing over at her. She pointed to a spot just ahead, where the asphalt seemed to shimmer in the heat. There I hesitated, but the look in her eyes told me not to argue. I eased off the gas and turned the wheel, guiding the truck off the highway and onto the dirt. The further we went, the more desolate the landscape became, until it felt like we were the only two people left in the world. "Are you sure this is the right way?" I asked, my voice betraying my unease. She didn't answer. She just kept staring straight ahead, her eyes locked on the path in front of us. The road grew narrower, the terrain more treacherous, and I started to wonder if I was being led into some kind of trap. But before I could voice my concerns, the truck lurched violently, and I slammed on the brakes. The headlights illuminated a sight that made my blood run cold. In front of us was a house, if you could even call it that. It was a decrepit, rotting structure, barely standing, its walls sagging inward as if they were about to collapse. But before I could react, she opened the door and climbed out of the truck, moving toward the house with that same unnatural stiffness I should have left. I should have just thrown the truck into reverse and gotten the hell out of there. But something kept me rooted to the spot. Watching as she approached the front door, she stopped just outside the doorway, turning to look back at me one last time. Her eyes were no longer hollow, they were filled with something dark, something malevolent, that sent a jolt of terror through me. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice dripping with a coldness that cut through the night air. The house stood silent and still, as if it had swallowed her whole. Then, without warning, the truck's engine sputtered and died, plunging me into an oppressive silence. The headlights flickered and went out, leaving me in total darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for the ignition, trying to restart the engine. But it was no use, the truck was dead, and I was stranded in the middle of nowhere, with no way to contact anyone. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, my legs trembling as I made my way toward the house. I had to see what had happened to her. I had to know if she was still inside. As I approached the front door, I could feel the air grow colder, the darkness pressing in on me from all sides. The house loomed above me, a decaying monument to some long-forgotten horror. I stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under my weight. The air was thick with the stench of mold and rot, and I had to fight the urge to gag. The interior was even worse than the outside. Broken furniture, peeling wallpaper, and debris littered the floor. But there was no sign of her. The house was empty, just an abandoned ruin with no indication that anyone had been there in years. I searched every room, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was nothing, no trace of the woman, no indication that she had ever existed. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. I was about to give up and leave when I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, coming from the far corner of the room. I turned, my flashlight beam catching a glimpse of something in the shadows. It was a photograph lying on the floor, covered in dust. I picked it up, wiping away the grime, and my heart nearly stopped. It was a picture of the woman, the same woman who had been in my truck, standing in front of this very house. But the photograph was old, decades old, judging by the yellowed edges and the faded colors. And beneath the photograph, scrawled in shaky handwriting, was a date. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. How could this be? How could she be in a photograph that was taken over 70 years ago? As I stood there, holding the photograph, I felt a cold breeze brush against my neck. I turned around, shining the flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty, decaying house. But I knew I wasn't alone. I could feel her presence, the weight of her gaze on me, watching from the shadows. And in that moment, I understood. She wasn't lost. She wasn't looking for a ride home. She was looking for something else, something that had been taken from her long ago, something that had kept her bound to this place, unable to move on. And now she had found it. I dropped the photograph and ran, stumbling through the darkness, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't stop until I was back in the truck, frantically turning the key in the ignition, praying that the engine would start. It roared to life on the first try, and I slammed the truck into gear, peeling out of there as fast as I could. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see if she was watching me from the doorway, if she was still waiting for something. I drove through the night, not stopping until I reached the nearest town, where I parked the truck and sat there, shaking, trying to make sense of what had happened. But I knew I never would. Some things can't be explained. Some things are better left forgotten. And some horrors are best left on the side of the road, in the darkness where they belong. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend getaway in the woods, a chance to escape the hustle and bustle of city life and reconnect with nature. My friend Mark and I had been planning this trip for months. and we were excited to spend a few days camping in a remote part of the forest, far from civilization. We packed our gear, loaded up the car, and set off early in the morning, eager to start our adventure. The drive took us deep into the heart of the forest, where the trees grew taller and the air felt fresher. As we drove further, the roads became narrower and more winding, until we finally reached the spot we had chosen for our campsite, a small clearing surrounded by dense woods. We pitched our tent, set up a campfire, and spent the afternoon exploring the area. The sky was clear, and the stars were bright, casting a soft glow over the forest. Everything seemed perfect. But as the night wore on, a strange feeling began to creep over me. It was as if the forest was watching us, the trees leaning in closer, the shadows growing darker. I brushed it off as nerves after all. We were miles from the nearest town, and the quiet was unsettling in its own way. We decided to turn in for the night, crawling into our tent and zipping up the entrance. The sound of the crackling fire outside and the occasional hoot of an owl were the only noises that broke the silence. I closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep, but the uneasy feeling lingered. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was jolted awake by a loud noise, a low, guttural growl that sent chills down my spine. At first I thought it was a dream, but then I heard it again, closer this time. My heart raced as I listened, trying to make out what it was. The growl was unlike anything I had ever heard before, deep and menacing, with a strange, almost human quality to it. I nudged Mark, who was sleeping beside me. "Did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. He grunted, half asleep, but then the growl came again, louder and more distinct. This time, Mark sat up, his eyes wide with fear. "What the hell was that?" he whispered back. We both stayed still, listening intently. The growling continued, now accompanied by the sound of something moving outside the tent, heavy footsteps, as if something large was circling our campsite. My mind raced as I tried to figure out what it could be. A bear? Maybe, but the growl didn't sound like a bear. He peeked out, shining the light into the darkness, but the beam only penetrated a few feet into the dense woods. "I don't see anything," he whispered, but his voice was shaking. He was just as scared as I was. Suddenly, the growling stopped, replaced by an eerie silence. For a moment, we both held our breath, waiting for whatever was out there to make its next move. And then, without warning, something slammed into the side of the tent, knocking us both backward. The force was so strong that the tent poles bent, and the fabric tore open, exposing us to the cold night air. We scrambled out of the tent, our hearts pounding in our chests. The campfire had burned down to embers, casting a faint orange glow over the clearing. I grabbed a stick from the fire and held it up like a torch, trying to see what had attacked us. And that's when I saw it, standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of the firelight. 'Twas a creature unlike anything I had ever seen. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with broad shoulders and long, muscular limbs. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, and its eyes glowed with an unnatural yellow light. But what terrified me the most was its face, a twisted, snarling visage that was part wolf, part man. For a moment I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or even think. The creature just stood there, watching us, its eyes locked onto mine. I could feel its hatred, its primal hunger, and I knew that we were in serious danger. "Run!" Mark shouted, snapping me out of my trance. We bolted, running as fast as we could into the woods, the creature's growls echoing behind us. The forest was dark, the trees looming like giant shadows, but we didn't stop. We didn't even look back. All I could think about was getting as far away from the thing as possible. We ran for what felt like hours, until our lungs burned and our legs felt like they would give out. Finally, we stumbled upon a dirt road, and in the distance I saw the faint glow of headlights. We flagged down the car, a couple of hunters who were just as shocked to see us as we were relieved to see them. They drove us back to town, where we collapsed in exhaustion, too scared to even speak the next day. We returned to the campsite with the hunters, hoping to retrieve our gear. But when we got there, everything was destroyed. The tent was ripped to shreds, our supplies scattered and broken. The ground was covered in deep, clawed footprints, and there were long, deep gouges in the trees around the clearing. We left without taking anything, too shaken to stay a moment longer. I haven't been back to the woods since, and I don't think I ever will. It was something ancient, something evil, something that should never have been disturbed. To this day, I can still hear its growl in my nightmares, and I wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing with fear. I know that no one will believe me, that they'll say it was just a bear or a vol from my imagination. But I know what I saw, and I know that there are things in this world that defy explanation, things that lurk in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. The world of filmmaking is glamorous, exciting, and full of creativity, but there's a darker side that people rarely talk about, a side where reality blurs with fiction, and where the stories being told on screen began to seep into the real world. I never believed in such things, not until I experienced it firsthand on the set of a horror movie that would never see the light of day. It all began when I was hired as the assistant director for a low-budget horror film being shot in the outskirts of an old, forgotten town. The script was nothing special, another tale of a haunted house and the unfortunate souls who stumble upon it. But there was something about the location that unsettled me from the moment we arrived. The house we were using for the shoot was ancient, a crumbling Victorian mansion that had been abandoned for decades. Its windows were shattered, the paint was peeling, and the surrounding grounds were overgrown with weeds. It was the perfect setting for a horror film, but there was an oppressive atmosphere that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. The locals warned us about the house, of course. They told stories of strange occurrences, of people who had gone missing, of ghostly apparitions seen in the windows at night. But we were filmmakers. We didn't believe in ghosts. The equipment malfunctioned in ways that defied explanation. Cameras would turn off by themselves, lights would flicker and die, and the sound equipment would pick up strange, distorted noises that we couldn't trace to any source. But the worst was yet to come. On the third day of filming, we were shooting a scene in the main hallway of the house. It was a simple shot, just the lead actress walking down the corridor. But no matter how many times we try, something always went wrong. The camera would refuse to focus, the lighting would dim for no reason, or the actress would trip over something that wasn't there. After several failed takes, the director, a seasoned professional named Jack, called for a break. We were all frustrated, exhausted, and starting to feel the weight of the strange occurrences. As the crew dispersed to take a breather, I noticed something odd about the hallway. There was a door at the far end that hadn't been there before. I'd been through that hallway countless times during location scouting and setup, and I was certain there had only been 3 doors, one leading to the kitchen, one to the dining room, and one to the basement. But now there was a 4th door, nestled between the dining room and the basement, slightly ajar as if beckoning someone to enter. Curiosity got the better of me, and I approached the door, pushing it open with a creak that echoed through the empty hallway. Inside was a small room, bare except for a dusty old mirror hanging on the far wall. The air inside was cold, much colder than the rest of the house, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Something about that mirror was wrong. It didn't just reflect the room. I could see something moving in the glass, a shadowy figure that wasn't there in reality. I stepped closer, trying to get a better look, and that's when the door slammed shut behind me. I spun around, my heart racing, but there was no one there. I was alone, locked in that tiny, freezing room with the mirror and whatever was inside it. The figure in the mirror grew clearer as I watched, taking on the shape of a person. No, not a person, a distorted version of me. It was like looking at a twisted reflection, something from a nightmare. The reflection's eyes were hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, and it reached out toward me as if trying to pull me into the glass. I stumbled back, banging on the door, screaming for someone to let me out. But the more I pounded, the further the room seemed to stretch, the walls elongating and the mirror growing larger until it dominated my entire field of vision. But just when I thought I would be swallowed by the darkness, the door flew open, and Jack stood there, staring at me with wide eyes. He pulled me out of the room, and as soon as I crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut again, disappearing into the wall as if it had never been there. "What the hell happened?" Jack demanded, his voice shaking. "We've been looking for you for hours," I was too shaken to answer. My watch said I'd only been in the room for a few minutes, but according to Jack, I'd been missing for nearly 3 hours. No one could explain where I'd gone or how I'd ended up in a room that didn't exist. From that day on, the strange occurrences on set escalated. Cast and crew members reported seeing shadows moving in the corners of their vision, hearing whispers when they were alone, and feeling unseen hands brush against them. Several people quit the production, unable to handle the mounting terror. One night, as we were reviewing the day's footage, we noticed something chilling. In every shot, there was a figure standing in the background, a shadowy figure that none of us had seen during filming. It was always there, watching, its form barely distinguishable in the darkness, but unmistakably present. The figure appeared to be wearing a long, dark cloak, and its face was obscured by a hood. We were plunged into complete darkness, and for a few terrifying seconds, the only sound was the frantic breathing of the cast and crew. When the lights flickered back on, Sarah was gone. We searched the basement, the house, and the surrounding area, but she was nowhere to be found. It was as if she had vanished into thin air, just like that door had vanished in the hallway. The production was shut down immediately. No one wanted to continue, not after what had happened to Sarah. The footage we'd shot was confiscated by the studio, and the project was buried, never to be released. To this day, no one knows what happened to Sarah. Some say she ran away, unable to cope with the fear and stress of the shoot. But I know the truth. I know she was taken by whatever dark force we had disturbed in that house, a force that had been waiting for someone to open the door to its world. I quit the film industry after that, unable to shake the feeling that something was still following me, watching me from the shadows. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees as I made my way deeper into the forest. I was on my annual solo camping trip, something I looked forward to every year. There was something about the isolation, the peace that came with being alone in the wild, that always helped me reset. This year I had chosen a spot far off the beaten path, a place that promised solitude and a chance to reconnect with nature. I had set up camp earlier in the day, pitching my tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, the smell of pine needles and earth filling my lungs as I took a deep breath. It was perfect just the kind of retreat I needed after the chaos of city life. As I gathered wood for a fire, I noticed how quiet the forest was. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing, that the animals were probably just settling in for the night. But the silence was unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. I built a fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort as the temperature began to drop. I sat by the fire, cooking dinner and listening to the crackling of the wood, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there. After dinner, I settled into my tent, zipping up the door and curling up in my sleeping bag. The fire outside was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the tent. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest outside, the darkness that surrounded me. I tried to reassure myself that I was safe, that there was nothing out there but the usual wildlife. But the silence was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I heard a low growl, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I held my breath, straining to hear, my heart beginning to race. The growl came again, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a menace that sent a chill down my spine. I slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim light over the clearing. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for the source of the growl, but all I could see were shadows. I listened intently, my senses on high alert, but the forest was silent once again. I debated whether to stoke the fire or retreat back into the tent. I didn't want to attract attention, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard in the dark. I decided to add a few more logs to the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. As I stood by the fire, tossing in the logs, I heard movement in the trees behind me, a rustling sound, followed by the snap of a twig. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something was moving just out of sight, but I couldn't see anything. I backed away from the edge of the clearing, my eyes never leaving the tree line. The growl came again, this time louder, closer, as if the creature was circling me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear, a wolf? But deep down I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I retreated to the tent, grabbing my flashlight and shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to reveal what was lurking in the shadows. The growl came again, and I could swear it was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Fear gripped me as I realized that whatever was out there was playing with me, toying with my senses. I knew I couldn't stay out in the open, but the thought of being trapped in the tent was equally terrifying. I needed to make a decision, and fast. I grabbed my pack, stuffing it with essentials, and prepared to leave. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing out there. I extinguished the fire, plunging the clearing into darkness, and quickly packed up the tent. My hands were shaking as I worked, my ears straining for any sound that would give away the creature's position. As I finished packing, I heard the growl again, closer than ever before. It was followed by a sound that sent a wave of terror through me, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Whatever it was coming for me. I slung the pack over my shoulder and took off into the forest, running as fast as I could. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted through the darkness, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. The growl echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. It was chasing me, and it was getting closer. I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning, my legs aching with the effort. I could hear the creature behind me, its breath heavy, its growls growing more ferocious. Panic surged through me as I realized I was losing ground. I had no idea how far the nearest road was, or if I would even make it that far. The creature was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. I spotted a large tree up ahead, its branches low and sturdy. Without thinking, I veered toward it, leaping up and grabbing hold of the lowest branch. I scrambled up, climbing higher and higher, until I was perched near the top, my body shaking with adrenaline. I looked down, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the forest floor below. The creature was there, its eyes glowing in the darkness as it prowled around the base of the tree. It was massive, its body covered in thick fur, its claws long and sharp. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing on two legs, its posture almost human-like. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't see me, that it would lose interest and move on. But the creature wasn't going anywhere. It circled the tree, growling softly, its eyes never leaving me. I could see its teeth, sharp and glistening in the moonlight, and I knew that if it got hold of me, I wouldn't stand a chance. I stayed in the tree for what felt like hours, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The creature continued to circle, its growls low and menacing, as if it was waiting for me to come down. I knew I couldn't stay up there forever, but I had no idea how I was going to escape. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a faint glow over the forest. The creature growled one last time, then turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the tree. I waited, not daring to move until I was sure it was gone. When I finally climbed down, my legs were weak, my body trembling with exhaustion. I didn't waste any time, grabbing my pack and making my way out of the forest as quickly as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car, where I collapsed into the driver's seat, my heart still racing. I never went back to that forest, and I never told anyone what happened. But the memory of that night still haunts me. The image of those glowing eyes and the sound of that growl forever etched in my mind. I don't know what that creature was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I was lucky to escape with my life. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows through the trees as I made my way deeper into the forest. I was on my annual solo camping trip, something I looked forward to every year. There was something about the isolation, the peace that came with being alone in the wild, that always helped me reset. This year I had chosen a spot far off the beaten path, a place that promised solitude and a chance to reconnect with nature. I had set up camp earlier in the day, pitching my tent in a small clearing surrounded by towering pines. The air was crisp, the smell of pine needles and earth filling my lungs as I took a deep breath. It was perfect, just the kind of retreat I needed after the chaos of city life. As I gathered wood for a fire, I noticed how quiet the forest was. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves were absent, replaced by an eerie stillness that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I told myself it was nothing, that the animals were probably just settling in for the night. But the silence was unsettling, like the forest was holding its breath. I built a fire, the warmth of the flames a welcome comfort as the temperature began to drop. I sat by the fire, cooking dinner and listening to the crackling of the wood, trying to shake off the feeling that something was watching me. Every so often, I would glance over my shoulder, expecting to see something lurking in the shadows, but there was nothing there. After dinner, I settled into my tent, zipping up the door and curling up in my sleeping bag. The fire outside was still burning low, casting flickering shadows on the walls of the tent. I closed my eyes, trying to relax, but sleep wouldn't come. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on me from all sides. I lay there for what felt like hours, my mind racing with thoughts of the forest outside, the darkness that surrounded me. I tried to reassure myself that I was safe, that there was nothing out there but the usual wildlife. But the silence was unnerving, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. And then I heard a low growl, so faint that I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. I held my breath, straining to hear, my heart beginning to race. The growl came again, this time closer, more distinct. It wasn't the sound of any animal I had ever heard before. It was deep, guttural, and filled with a menace that sent a chill down my spine. I slowly unzipped the tent, peering out into the darkness. The fire had burned down to embers, casting a dim light over the clearing. My eyes scanned the trees, searching for the source of the growl, but all I could see were shadows. I listened intently, my senses on high alert, but the forest was silent once again. I debated whether to stoke the fire or retreat back into the tent. I didn't want to attract attention, but I also didn't want to be caught off guard in the dark. I decided to add a few more logs to the fire, hoping the flames would keep whatever was out there at bay. As I stood by the fire, tossing in the logs, I heard movement in the trees behind me, a rustling sound, followed by the snap of a twig. I spun around, my heart pounding, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to shift, as if something was moving just out of sight, but I couldn't see anything. I backed away from the edge of the clearing, my eyes never leaving the tree line. The growl came again, this time louder, closer, as if the creature was circling me. My mind raced with possibilities. Was it a bear, a wolf? But deep down I knew it was something else, something I couldn't explain. I retreated to the tent, grabbing my flashlight and shining it into the trees. The beam cut through the darkness, but it did little to reveal what was lurking in the shadows. The growl came again, and I could swear it was right behind me. I whipped around, but there was nothing there. Fear gripped me as I realized that whatever was out there was playing with me, toying with my senses. I knew I couldn't stay out in the open, but the thought of being trapped in the tent was equally terrifying. I needed to make a decision, and fast. I grabbed my pack, stuffing it with essentials, and prepared to leave. I couldn't stay here, not with that thing out there. I extinguished the fire, plunging the clearing into darkness, and quickly packed up the tent. My hands were shaking as I worked, my ears straining for any sound that would give away the creature's position. As I finished packing, I heard the growl again, closer than ever before. It was followed by a sound that sent a wave of terror through me, the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on the forest floor. Whatever it was coming from me. I slung the pack over my shoulder and took off into the forest, running as fast as I could. The trees blurred past me as I sprinted through the darkness, my flashlight bouncing in my hand. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I had to get away. The growl echoed through the trees, followed by the sound of something crashing through the underbrush. It was chasing me, and it was getting closer. I pushed myself to run faster, my lungs burning, my legs aching with the effort. I could hear the creature behind me, its breath heavy, its growls growing more ferocious. Panic surged through me as I realized I was losing ground. I had no idea how far the nearest road was, or if I would even make it that far. The creature was relentless, and it was only a matter of time before it caught up to me. I spotted a large tree up ahead, its branches low, and sturdy. Without thinking, I veered toward it, leaping up and grabbing hold of the lowest branch. I scrambled up, climbing higher and higher until I was perched near the top, my body shaking with adrenaline. I looked down, my heart pounding in my chest as I scanned the forest floor below. The creature was there, its eyes glowing in the darkness as it prowled around the base of the tree. It was massive, its body covered in thick fur, its claws long and sharp. It looked like a wolf, but it was standing on two legs, its posture almost human-like. I held my breath, praying it wouldn't see me, that it would lose interest and move on. But the creature wasn't going anywhere. It circled the tree, growling softly, its eyes never leaving me. I could see its teeth, sharp and glistening in the moonlight, and I knew that if it got hold of me, I wouldn't stand a chance. I stayed in the tree for what felt like hours, my body trembling with fear and exhaustion. The creature continued to circle, its growls low and menacing, as if it was waiting for me to come down. I knew I couldn't stay up there forever, but I had no idea how I was going to escape. Eventually, the first light of dawn began to break through the trees, casting a faint glow over the forest. The creature growled one last time, then turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving me alone in the tree. I waited, not daring to move until I was sure it was gone. When I finally climbed down, my legs were weak, my body trembling with exhaustion. I didn't waste any time, grabbing my pack and making my way out of the forest as quickly as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the safety of my car, where I collapsed into the driver's seat, my heart still racing. I never went back to that forest, and I never told anyone what happened. But the memory of that night still haunts me. The image of those glowing eyes and the sound of that growl forever etched in my mind. I don't know what that creature was, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I was lucky to escape with my life.